Hey there, night owls! Tonight we're talking about one of history's wildest road trips, the First Crusade. Picture this. Tens of thousands of Europeans deciding to march across two continents to reclaim a city most of them had never seen, through lands they couldn't pronounce, fighting enemies they'd only heard about in sermons. Spoiler alert, things got messy. But here's the thing. This wasn't just some medieval military campaign. This was the moment three civilizations collided head-on, when religious fervour met political chaos, when desperate Byzantine emperors made deals they'd regret, and when a ragtag army of knights, peasants, and straight-up fanatics somehow pulled off what everyone thought was impossible. Before we dive into this absolute chaos of a story, do me a favour, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Seriously, I want to know if you're in Tokyo at sunrise or Chicago at midnight. And hey, hit that like button if you're ready for some real medieval drama. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's roll back to the year 1095, when Pope Urban II stood up and changed history forever. So let's set the stage properly here, because the world of the late 11th century looked absolutely nothing like the tidy little maps you probably saw in your high school textbook. This wasn't a world of clear borders and unified nations with convenient colour coding. No, this was a world in absolute flux, where empires were crumbling in slow motion, new powers were rising with alarming speed, and pretty much everyone was eyeing everyone else's territory like it was the last slice of pizza at a party. The Eastern Mediterranean in the thousands was basically a geopolitical pressure cooker, and someone had just cranked up the heat. You had three major players circling each other like wary cats. The Byzantine Empire, desperately trying to pretend it was still the Roman Empire and that everything was totally fine. The Islamic world, which was itself fractured into competing dynasties who couldn't agree on much except that they really didn't like each other. And Western Europe, which was just starting to get its act together after centuries of what historians politely call the early medieval period, and what everyone else calls that time when Vikings kept showing up uninvited. Now, here's where it gets interesting. These three civilizations weren't just different, they were operating on completely different wavelengths. The Byzantines looked at the Western Europeans and saw unsophisticated barbarians who couldn't even use a fork properly. Not an exaggeration, by the way. Forks weren't a thing in Western Europe yet, which made for some awkward diplomatic dinners. The Western Europeans looked at the Byzantines and saw effete, untrustworthy Greeks who were suspiciously good at philosophy and had way too many baths. Meanwhile, the Islamic world was dealing with its own internal drama, because when you have multiple caliphates claiming to be the one true successor to Muhammad, things get complicated fast. The Byzantines, for centuries, they'd been the superpower of the Mediterranean world, the continuation of Rome itself, the defenders of Christendom against everyone from Persians to Arabs to Bulgarians. Their capital was the richest, most sophisticated city in Europe, possibly in the world. While Western Europe was still figuring out how to build in stone again, Constantinople had running water, a university and an economy that made everyone else look like they were operating a lemonade stand. But by the mid-1000s, that glory was starting to look a bit faded around the edges. The empire was still impressive, sure, but it was impressive in the way a really expensive car is still impressive even when the check engine light has been on for a suspiciously long time. The military, once the most professional fighting force in the known world, was increasingly staffed by mercenaries who were loyal to whoever paid them most recently. The bureaucracy, which had been the empire's secret weapon for centuries, had become so bloated and corrupt that getting anything done required approximately 17 officials, 4 bribes, and a letter from someone's cousin. The Islamic world, meanwhile, was going through its own period of rapid change. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had once ruled from Spain to Central Asia, had fragmented into competing dynasties. The Fatimids controlled Egypt and claimed to be the rightful caliphs. The Umayyads in Spain also claimed to be the rightful caliphs. The Abbasids in Baghdad still claimed to be the rightful caliphs, though by this point they controlled about as much territory as a mid-sized mayor and had about as much actual power. It was like having 3 different people all claiming to be the CEO of the same company, except with more swords and significantly less paperwork. Then you had the new kids on the block, the Seljuk Turks. Now the Seljuks were a completely different beast. They weren't interested in the theological debates that kept Arab scholars up at night, and they weren't impressed by the Byzantine Empire's 1,000-year pedigree. They were a confederation of Turkic tribes from Central Asia who had converted to Islam and decided that the entire Middle East looked like it could use some new management. Their approach to warfare was straightforward. They had cavalry, they had composite bows, and they had an alarming tendency to win battles. This was not great news for basically anyone who wasn't a Seljuk. Western Europe, for its part, was just starting to emerge from what historians used to call the Dark Ages, before everyone agreed that was maybe too dramatic. The population was growing, agricultural productivity was improving thanks to new farming techniques, and the feudal system had calcified into a reasonably stable social order, where everyone knew their place, even if their place was perpetually covered in mud and owned by someone else. The church had become the single most powerful institution in Western Europe, which was saying something given that it didn't technically have an army, though it did have the ability to tell kings they were going to hell, which turned out to be surprisingly effective. The religious landscape was particularly complicated. The church in Rome and the church in Constantinople had been drifting apart for centuries over various theological issues that both sides insisted were absolutely critical, like whether the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father alone or from the Father and the Son, and whether priests should be allowed to have beards, and whether bread should be leavened or unleavened during communion. To modern ears, this might sound like the kind of thing you'd shrug off and agree to disagree about, but in the 11th century, this was the stuff of genuine civilizational divide. The result was that by 1095, you had two versions of Christianity that viewed each other with deep suspicion. The Orthodox Christians in the Byzantine Empire thought the Catholic Church in Rome was run by arrogant heretics who had corrupted the true faith. The Catholic Church thought the Orthodox Christians were schismatic Greeks who stubbornly refused to acknowledge the Pope's authority. Both sides were absolutely certain they were right, and both sides had approximately zero interest in compromise. This is going to become extremely relevant, because nothing smooths over theological differences quite like trying to fight a war together. Spoiler alert, it doesn't go well. Meanwhile, the Islamic world had its own internal religious divisions that were just as bitter. The split between Sunni and Shia Islam had occurred centuries earlier, but by the thousands it had crystallized into competing political dynasties. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt was Shia, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was Sunni, and the Seljuks, who were rapidly taking over large chunks of both empires, were also Sunni but had their own ideas about how things should be run. Add in various local dynasties, tribal confederations, and independent cities, and you had a religious and political landscape that made Game of Thrones look straightforward. The economic situation was equally complex. Constantinople sat at the crossroads of trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa. Silk from China, spices from India, slaves from the Black Sea, furs from Russia, grain from Egypt, all of it flowed through Byzantine ports, and the empire took its cut. The Italian city-states, particularly Venice and Genoa, were increasingly involved in this trade, which meant they had a vested interest in keeping the eastern Mediterranean politically stable. Unfortunately, political stability was in increasingly short supply. Agricultural patterns were shifting too. The medieval warm period, which we'll talk about more later, was making northern Europe more productive, which meant more food, which meant more people, which meant more younger sons who weren't going to inherit land and needed something to do with their lives. In a society where the primary occupation for aristocratic males was professional warrior, having a surplus of ambitious young men with military training and no prospects was like having a warehouse full of gunpowder and no fire safety regulations. Something was going to blow up eventually. Climate wasn't helping matters in the Middle East, where the same warming trend that was benefiting Europe was causing droughts and disrupting traditional agricultural patterns. When you combine climate stress with political instability and religious fervour, you get a recipe for conflict that's been proven time and time again throughout history. The 11th century was no exception. Technology was also playing a role, though not in the way you might think. This wasn't the age of gunpowder yet. That was still a couple centuries away in Europe. But military technology was advancing in subtle ways. Heavy cavalry had become the dominant force on European battlefields, which required enormous investment in horses, armour and training. A fully equipped knight represented something like buying a luxury car and a small house at the same time, which meant warfare was increasingly the domain of the wealthy. The Byzantines, meanwhile, had refined combined arms tactics to an art form, mixing cavalry, infantry and archers in sophisticated formations that should have given them an advantage. Should have. We'll get to why it didn't. The Seljuk Turks, for their part, brought their own military innovations from the steppes of Central Asia. Their cavalry tactics emphasized mobility and archery, shooting from horseback with composite bows that could punch through armor at impressive distances. They perfected the feigned retreat, where they'd pretend to flee, draw the enemy into pursuit, then wheel around and shred them with arrows. This was extremely effective against enemies who weren't expecting it, which unfortunately for the Byzantines described Byzantine armies perfectly. Communication across this vast region was slow and unreliable. A message from Rome to Constantinople might take weeks or months, depending on the season and whether the roads were safe. Information travelled at roughly the speed of a horse, which meant that by the time you heard about an event it might be completely out of date. This communication lag is going to be hugely important later, because crusaders would make decisions based on information that was months old. Treaties would be negotiated without knowledge of changing circumstances, and misunderstandings would compound into full-blown disasters. The intellectual landscape was equally fragmented. The Islamic world was in the middle of what historians call its golden age, with scholars making advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that wouldn't reach Europe for centuries. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, even in its declining years, was producing work that made most European scholarship look like finger painting. The Byzantines maintained their own scholarly traditions, preserving Greek classical texts that had been lost in the West. Western Europe, meanwhile, was just starting to build its first universities and was mostly focused on theology and canon law. The irony that the most backward civilization was about to invade the most advanced ones was apparently lost on everyone at the time. Religious pilgrimage was already a well-established practice by the late 11th century. Christians had been travelling to Jerusalem for centuries, viewing it as the holiest site in their faith, the place where Jesus had been crucified and resurrected. These pilgrimages were considered spiritually meritorious, a way to demonstrate devotion and potentially earn salvation. The journey was dangerous, expensive, and time-consuming, which apparently made it more, not less, appealing. Medieval Christians had a complicated relationship with suffering. They believed it was good for the soul, which is not exactly the modern approach to vacation planning. Sure, you might get robbed by bandits, die of disease, drown in a storm, or succumb to any number of other travel-related mishaps that would definitely get you a refund from your travel insurance if travel insurance had existed. But the Muslim rulers of Jerusalem generally tolerated Christian pilgrims, seeing them as a source of revenue and no particular threat. The Holy Sepulchre, the church built on the supposed site of Jesus' tomb, had been destroyed in 1009 by the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, who had something of a reputation for erratic behaviour, understatement of the century, but it had been rebuilt, and pilgrims were once again flowing in. However, the recent Seljuk conquest of Jerusalem in 1073 had disrupted this relatively stable arrangement. The Seljuks were more militant, less interested in accommodating Christian pilgrims, and frankly had more pressing concerns than managing tourism. Reports began filtering back to Europe, how accurate they were is anyone's guess, of pilgrims being harassed, churches being desecrated, and the holy sites becoming inaccessible. Whether these reports were exaggerated for propaganda purposes is a question historians still debate, but the perception in Western Europe was that the Holy Land was in crisis and needed rescue. This perception was amplified by the Byzantine Empire's increasing desperation. As we're about to see in detail, the Byzantines were losing territory at an alarming rate to the Seljuks. The empire that had once controlled all of Asia Minor, the Balkans, southern Italy, and chunks of the Middle East had been reduced to a fraction of its former size. Constantinople itself wasn't under immediate threat yet, but the empire was bleeding territory, revenue, and prestige. The Byzantine emperors needed help, and they needed it badly. The stage was set, then, for one of history's most consequential collisions. You had a Western European civilization that was growing in confidence and population, full of warriors looking for purpose and preachers promising salvation. You had a Byzantine Empire that was desperate for military assistance but deeply suspicious of Western intentions. You had a fractured Islamic world that was caught up in its own internal conflicts and didn't initially take the threat from the West seriously. And you had religious fervour on all sides, each convinced of their divine mandate and the righteousness of their cause. None of them had any idea what they were about to unleash. The First Crusade would reshape the medieval world, create lasting wounds between Christianity and Islam, destroy any hope of healing the split between Eastern and Western Christianity, and set the pattern for religious warfare that would echo for centuries. But in 1095, all of that was still in the future. First, we need to understand how the Byzantine Empire went from being the superpower of the Mediterranean to desperate enough to ask the barbaric West for help. Because that's where our story really begins, with the slow-motion collapse of an empire that thought it was eternal. Let's talk about the Byzantine Empire at its peak, because it's important to understand just how far and how fast it fell. In the year 1025, the Byzantine Empire was the most powerful state in the Christian world, And it wasn't even close. Under Emperor Basil II, who ruled from 976 to 1025, the empire had reconquered vast territories, crushed its enemies, and restored something approaching its ancient glory. Basil wasn't called the Bulgar Slayer because he was good at diplomacy, though that name does have a certain PR problem in modern times, but because he had definitively defeated the Bulgarian Empire in a series of brutal campaigns that ended with Bulgaria being fully absorbed into the Byzantine realm. Basil II was, by any measure, a remarkable ruler, though not necessarily one you'd want to invite to dinner. He never married, had no children, and devoted his entire life to the empire with a single-minded intensity that bordered on obsessive. He personally led his armies on campaign, lived simply by imperial standards, which still meant more luxury than 99% of humanity, but relatively simply, and had a reputation for being completely incorruptible. In an empire where corruption was practically an Olympic sport, this made him something of an anomaly. His military reforms had rebuilt the Byzantine army into a formidable fighting force. He strengthened the theme system, the empire's provincial military organization that combined civil administration with military defense. He relied heavily on the Varangian Guard, elite Norse warriors who had travelled down the rivers of Russia to serve in Constantinople and had absolutely no ties to Byzantine political factions, which made them reliably loyal. When you're an emperor, having bodyguards who don't care about local politics and just want to get paid and occasionally split people open with axes is actually ideal. The economy under Basil was remarkably strong. The imperial treasury was overflowing, reportedly containing around £200,000 of gold at his death, which in modern terms would be worth. Honestly, trying to convert medieval gold reserves to modern currency gets complicated fast. But let's just say it was enough to run the empire for years without raising taxes. Trade was flourishing, the currency was stable, and Constantinople was the commercial hub of the known world. If you wanted silk, spices, precious metals, or really anything valuable, it probably passed through Byzantine ports at some point. The empire's territory under Basil stretched from southern Italy to Armenia, from the Danube to Syria. It controlled the Mediterranean shipping lanes, the Black Sea trade routes, and the land routes connecting Europe to Asia. This wasn't just economically valuable, it was strategically crucial. An enemy wanting to attack the empire had to either come by sea, where Byzantine naval power was supreme, or through mountain passes and fortified borders where the Byzantine army could choose where to fight. Culturally, the empire was at a high point as well. Constantinople's population was around 400,000, making it by far the largest city in Christendom and one of the largest in the world. Its libraries preserved classical Greek and Roman texts that had been lost in the West. Its university trained scholars in philosophy, law, mathematics, and theology. The Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral of Constantinople, was an architectural marvel that made Western European churches look like garden sheds by comparison. Visitors from Western Europe would arrive in Constantinople and basically experience the medieval equivalent of a country farmer walking into Manhattan for the first time. Everything was bigger, richer, more sophisticated, and more than a little overwhelming. The bureaucracy, that hallmark of Roman governance that the Byzantines had inherited and refined, was functioning smoothly. The empire had a professional civil service with defined roles and responsibilities, regular salaries, and career advancement based at least theoretically on merit. This was revolutionary stuff. Most of Western Europe was still running on a system where governance meant whoever has the most swords gets to be in charge. The Byzantine system wasn't perfect, and corruption was always a problem, but it was leagues ahead of anything else in Christian Europe. Military technology and tactics were similarly advanced. The Byzantines had developed Greek fire, an incendiary weapon that burned even on water, and whose exact composition remains unknown to this day, making it history's most effective classified military secret. Their navy was the most powerful in the Mediterranean, capable of projecting force and protecting trade routes. Their army used sophisticated combined arms tactics, mixing heavily armoured cavalry, infantry formations, and archers in coordinated strategies that would have made a Western European army look like a mob of enthusiastic amateurs. So in 1025, when Basil died at the age of 67, the Byzantine Empire was arguably at its zenith. It had wealth, power, military strength, cultural sophistication, and strategic position. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as it turns out, pretty much everything. The problem started with succession. Basil had never married and had no children, which in retrospect seems like a significant oversight for someone who spent 50 years building up an empire. The throne passed to his brother Constantine VIII, who had technically been co-emperor for decades but had spent that entire time doing essentially nothing. Constantine was 65 years old when he finally got to rule alone, and his primary qualifications for the job were being related to Basil and still breathing. These are not ideal credentials for managing an empire. Constantine VIII's 3-year reign from 1025 to 1028 was basically a preview of the coming disaster. He had no military experience, no interest in governance, and spent most of his time enjoying the luxuries of the palace, while the carefully constructed machinery of Basil's administration began to rust from neglect. He didn't go on campaign, didn't reform the bureaucracy, didn't address any of the underlying structural issues in the empire. He just sort of existed. On the plus side, he didn't actively destroy anything, which in the context of what came later starts to look like an achievement. Constantine died in 1028, and the succession got even messier. He had 3 daughters but no sons, which meant the throne would pass to whoever married his eldest daughter Zoe. She was around 50 at the time. Medieval marriages usually happened much earlier, but her father had refused to marry her off because he was paranoid about creating rival claimants to the throne. So Romanos III's reign from 1028 to 1034 was where things really started to slide. He fancied himself a military man and launched a campaign against the Arabs in Syria, which went badly. Not catastrophically, not entire army destroyed badly, but definitely embarrassing and expensive badly. The campaign achieved nothing except depleting the treasury and demonstrating that the emperor had no idea what he was doing. The army's morale, which had been high under Basil's competent leadership, began to decline as soldiers realized their new commander was, to put it charitably, learning on the job. Domestically, Romanos tried to present himself as a philosopher-emperor in the classical mould, a new Marcus Aurelius guiding the empire with wisdom and learning. The problem was that Marcus Aurelius could actually fight and Romanos couldn't. He built churches and patronized scholars, which was nice, but he neglected the military and let the bureaucracy become increasingly corrupt. Government positions that had been awarded based on ability under Basil were now being sold to the highest bidder. It's hard to run an effective administration when everyone from the tax collector to the provincial governor bought their job and is primarily interested in recouping their investment. Then there's the matter of how Romanos died. The official story is that he drowned in his bath in 1034. The unofficial story, the one everyone in Constantinople definitely believed, is that his wife Zoe and her lover Michael had him murdered. Whether he actually drowned accidentally or was drowned on purpose is one of those historical questions where the answer is probably, we'll never know for sure, but come on. Zoe married Michael the day after Romanos died, which didn't exactly dispel the rumours. Michael IV became emperor in 1034, and here's where you might think things would improve, because Michael was actually a competent administrator and military commander. He personally led campaigns against the Arabs and the Bulgarians and achieved some genuine successes. He reformed the currency, which had started to be debased under his predecessors. He tried to tackle corruption in the bureaucracy, which was like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon, but at least he was trying. The problem was that Michael had epilepsy, which in the 11th century was not well understood and definitely not well treated. As his reign progressed, his seizures became more frequent and severe. He became increasingly paranoid, convinced that his illness was divine punishment for his sins, which, given that those sins included possibly murdering the previous emperor and definitely sleeping with the emperor's wife before said emperor was conveniently dead, wasn't entirely unreasonable from his perspective. He eventually retreated to a monastery, where he died in 1041 after just 7 years on the throne. His nephew Michael V succeeded him and immediately demonstrated why nepotism is a bad idea. Michael V lasted less than a year. His primary accomplishment was trying to exile his adoptive mother Zoe. Yes, the same Zoe who had now survived 3 husbands, which caused riots in Constantinople. The city's population, who apparently had developed a soft spot for Zoe despite her questionable taste in husbands, rose up in revolt. Michael V was captured, blinded, that traditional Byzantine punishment that keeps coming up, and exiled to a monastery. The entire reign lasted about 4 months, making it possibly the most efficient imperial failure in Byzantine history. Zoe, now in her 60s and having outlasted 4 emperors, ruled briefly alongside her sister Theodora, before marrying husband number 3, Constantine IX Monomachos, who became emperor in 1042. Constantine IX was, by the standards of Byzantine emperors, not terrible. He was cultured, enjoyed the arts, patronized scholars, and didn't actively destroy anything important. He also didn't fix anything important, But at this point, not making things worse was starting to look like a success criterion. Constantine's reign from 1042 to 1055 was marked by administrative reform. He reorganized the themes and attempted to professionalize the bureaucracy, and by a notable lack of military success. The empire fought wars against the Pechenegs in the Balkans, the Rus to the north, and the Seljuk Turks to the east, and generally didn't win any of them decisively. The army that Basilthecu had forged into a powerful instrument was increasingly filled with mercenaries rather than native Byzantine soldiers, because maintaining a professional military was expensive, and cutting military spending freed up money for other things, like palaces and mistresses. This is the kind of short-term thinking that feels smart right up until an enemy army appears on your doorstep. The Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, and the Pope's legates excommunicated each other in a dispute over theological issues and ecclesiastical authority that had been brewing for centuries. Constantine tried to mediate but ultimately failed, and the split that had been forming for generations became official. This is going to be extremely relevant later, because it meant that when Western Catholic crusaders showed up in Constantinople, they were viewed not as fellow Christians coming to help, but as heretics who were technically excommunicated. Nothing builds military cooperation quite like mutual excommunication. Constantine died in 1055, and after a brief reign by Theodora, Zoe had died in 1050, finally ending her remarkable run of outliving emperors. The throne passed to a series of emperors who were essentially placeholders. Michael VI lasted a year before being overthrown. Isaac Komnenos, a capable general, seized power in 1057 but abdicated in 1059 due to illness, possibly because he realized that being emperor was a terrible job with a high mortality rate. The throne then passed to Constantine the Ducas, and this is where the military situation really deteriorated. Constantine the X, ruling from 1059 to 1067, was a civilian administrator who believed the empire's problems could be solved through diplomacy and administrative reform rather than military strength. This would be a bit like believing you can solve a home invasion through careful tax policy. He cut military spending dramatically, reduced the size of the army, and relied increasingly on mercenaries and diplomatic agreements to secure the borders. To be fair to Constantine, maintaining a large standing army was incredibly expensive. The theme system, which had combined military defense with civil administration, was breaking down as powerful landowners bought up small farms and corrupted the system. The soldiers, who were supposed to be self-supporting through their land grants, were either losing their lands or not maintaining their military equipment. Recruiting and paying professional soldiers cost money, and the treasury, while still substantial, was not the overflowing font of gold it had been under Basil II. But the Seljuk Turks, who we'll discuss in detail next, were rapidly expanding their territory and proving themselves formidable warriors. The Pechenegs and Cumans were raiding the Balkans with increasing frequency. The Normans, Vikings who had settled in northern France, become Christian and somehow become even more dangerous, were conquering southern Italy and looking hungrily at the empire's remaining Italian territories. The empire needed a strong military, and Constantine gave it budget cuts. This was going to end well, you can just tell. Constantine the Vex died in 1067, leaving his widow Eudokia Macrembolitissa as regent for their young sons. Eudokia, to her credit, recognized that the empire needed a military emperor, so she married Romanos IV Diogenes, a general who seemed like he might be able to restore Byzantine military power. Romanos IV's reign from 1068 to 1071 was marked by energetic campaigning against the Turks, genuine attempts to rebuild the army, and ultimately catastrophic failure. Romanos was everything Constantine the Vex wasn't: a warrior, a military commander, a man of action. He led multiple campaigns into Anatolia, trying to stop the Turkish raids and reconquer lost territory. The problem was that the army he inherited was a shadow of what Basil Theon had commanded. The professional corps was depleted, the theme system was broken, and the army was increasingly composed of mercenaries of questionable loyalty. Romanos was trying to rebuild a house while living in it during a hurricane. The court politics were also working against him. He had enemies among the aristocracy who resented his marriage to the previous emperor's widow and his control over the empire. The Ducas family, relatives of Constantine the Vex, particularly opposed him and actively undermined his authority. So Romanos was trying to fight a war against the Turks while also fighting a political war against his own court. This is not ideal when you're trying to save an empire. The financial situation was deteriorating as well. The gold numisma, the Byzantine currency that had been stable for centuries, was being debased to meet expenses. When you start mixing copper into your gold coins, everyone notices, and confidence in the currency drops. Trade was still flowing through Constantinople, but the empire was taking a smaller cut as Italian merchants negotiated better terms and established their own trading networks that bypassed Byzantine control. The monopoly on Mediterranean trade that had been the empire's economic foundation was eroding. The bureaucracy, once the empire's strength, had become part of the problem. Positions were bought and sold, officials were primarily interested in enriching themselves, and the efficient administration that had been Rome's legacy was bogging down in corruption and incompetence. Tax collection was irregular and often brutal, which didn't endear the government to its subjects. Provincial administration was weak, with local strongmen often wielding more practical authority than imperial governors. The cultural and intellectual life of Constantinople remained vibrant. The city was still producing scholars, artists, and theologians. But there's something poignant about an empire producing brilliant philosophical treatises while its armies are being destroyed and its territories are being stripped away. It's like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, except the Titanic is on fire and also being attacked by pirates. The empire's strategic position was also worsening. The Italian territories were effectively lost, with Norman adventurers carving out their own states. The Balkans were unstable, with various peoples raiding and settling in imperial territory. Armenia, which had been a buffer state on the eastern frontier, was being absorbed by the empire in a move that looked good on paper, but actually extended imperial borders right up against the expanding Seljuk Turks. This is what's known in strategic terms as a bad idea. The religious situation added another layer of complexity. The empire's population was diverse: Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, and others, with different Christian traditions and varying degrees of loyalty to Constantinople. The schism with Rome in 1054 had deepened the divide between Orthodox and Catholic Christianity, which was going to make any alliance with Western Europe extremely complicated. The empire also had Jewish and Muslim minorities who were generally tolerated but not exactly enthusiastic about dying for Byzantine territorial integrity. What the Byzantine Empire needed in the late 1060s was what it had enjoyed under Basil Ray: competent military leadership, administrative efficiency, adequate funding, internal political stability, and time to rebuild. What it got instead was Romanos IV leading an increasingly unreliable army into a decisive battle against the Seljuk Turks, a court full of rivals waiting for him to fail, a depleted treasury, and absolutely no time at all. The stage was set for disaster. And at Manzikert in 1071, disaster arrived right on schedule. So while the Byzantine Empire was busy imploding in slow motion, dealing with incompetent emperors and court intrigue and all the drama that comes with being a 1,000-year-old empire past its prime, something else was happening to the east. A new power was rising, and it was coming from a direction that the Byzantines really weren't prepared for. The Seljuk Turks didn't emerge from some established civilization with libraries and universities and complicated philosophical debates about the nature of the Trinity. They came from the Central Asian steppes, that vast expanse of grassland stretching from Mongolia to the Black Sea that had been producing waves of horse-riding conquerors for millennia. The Seljuks were originally part of the Oghuz Turkic Confederation, nomadic peoples who lived in felt tents, herded livestock, and had a military culture that made professional Byzantine soldiers look like they were playing dress-up. Now, nomadic peoples don't get a lot of respect in traditional history. They don't build impressive stone monuments, they don't leave behind extensive written records, and their capitals tend to be wherever they happen to pitch their tents that week. But underestimating nomadic warriors is a mistake that settled civilizations have been making for thousands of years, usually right before those nomadic warriors burn down their cities and redraw the map. The Mongols would prove this point dramatically in the next century, but the Seljuks were demonstrating it quite effectively in the 11th. The Seljuks took their name from their legendary founder, Seljuk, who had been a military commander in the service of the Oghuz Yabgu state in the 10th century. The story goes that Seljuk had a falling out with his overlord. The details vary depending on which source you read, but apparently being a nomadic warrior leader in Central Asia involved a lot of political drama and occasional murder plots, and struck out on his own with his followers. He converted to Sunni Islam, which was a smart political move given that the Islamic world was the rising power in the region, and established his clan as an independent force. By the early 11th century, Seljuk's grandsons were leading the confederation, and they had their eyes on bigger prizes than cattle raids and tribal politics. The Islamic world to their south was fractured and wealthy, which from a nomadic warrior's perspective is basically a flashing neon sign saying opportunity. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was weak. The various regional dynasties were fighting among themselves, and the whole region looked ripe for conquest by someone with sufficient military force and ambition. The Seljuks had both in abundance. Their military advantages were straightforward but devastating. First, they were all cavalry, not just some of the army, not just the elite units, but essentially everyone who mattered militarily was mounted. They grew up on horses, lived on horses, and could do things on horseback that would make a modern rodeo champion look like a beginner. They could shoot arrows accurately at full gallop, something that takes years of practice and is genuinely difficult to do well. Try shooting a bow while running sometime and you'll appreciate the skill involved. Then imagine doing it on a horse moving at 30 miles per hour. Second, their composite bows were technological marvels. These weren't simple wooden longbows. They were constructed from wood, horn, and sinew, laminated together in a process that took months and produced a weapon that could punch through armor at 100 yards. The Seljuks could shower an enemy formation with arrows from a distance, wheel away before the enemy could close, and repeat the process until the enemy was sufficiently softened up for a direct assault. This was combined arms warfare at its finest, except it was all cavalry doing all the roles. Third, and this is crucial, they were incredibly mobile. A Byzantine army might cover 10 or 15 miles a day on a good day, with all its baggage and infantry and supply wagons. A Seljuk force could cover 30 or 40 miles without breaking a sweat, and they could live off their herds and whatever they could forage. They didn't need elaborate supply lines or siege trains or any of the logistics that made medieval warfare such a complex undertaking. They were basically the medieval equivalent of a rapid deployment force, except they deployed by horse, and their idea of rules of engagement was win by any means necessary. The Seljuk expansion into the Islamic world began in earnest in the 1030s under the leadership of Tughril Beg, Seljuk's grandson. Tughril was one of those leaders who combined military brilliance with political savvy, which is a rare and dangerous combination. He understood that conquering territory was one thing, but holding it required legitimacy, and legitimacy in the Islamic world meant working within the existing religious and political frameworks, at least nominally. In 1040, Tughril and his brother Chagri defeated the Ghaznavids, the existing power in the region, at the Battle of Dandana Khan. This was a decisive victory that announced the Seljuks as a major power. The Ghaznavids had been the dominant force in eastern Iran and Central Asia, with a professional army and established administration, and the Seljuks absolutely destroyed them. It's worth noting that the Ghaznavids weren't slouches. They had conquered much of northern India, and were experienced in fighting both nomadic raiders and settled armies. The Seljuks beat them anyway, which should have been a warning to everyone else in the region about what was coming. Following this victory, Tughril began a systematic conquest of Persia. City after city fell to the Seljuks, sometimes through military force, sometimes through diplomacy, often through a combination of both. The Persian cities were wealthy but divided, and the Seljuks exploited every division and weakness. Local dynasties that thought they could play the Seljuks off against each other found themselves absorbed into the expanding Seljuk realm. It was like watching dominoes fall, except the dominoes were ancient cities, and the person knocking them over was riding a horse and shooting arrows. By 1055, Tughril had conquered enough territory that he felt confident marching on Baghdad itself. Now Baghdad at this point was still nominally the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, the supreme religious and political authority of Sunni Islam. In practice, the caliph controlled roughly as much territory as a suburban mayor and had about as much real power. The city had been under the control of the Boyards, a Persian Shia dynasty, which created an awkward situation where the Sunni caliph was basically a prisoner in his own capital, kept around for legitimacy, but not allowed to actually do anything. Tughril's army entered Baghdad in December 1055, and this is where his political intelligence really showed. He didn't sack the city or execute the caliph or do any of the things that conquering armies traditionally did. Instead, he presented himself as the champion of Sunni Islam, liberating the caliph from Shia heretics. The caliph, who presumably knew a good deal when he saw one, formally recognized Tughril as sultan, meaning authority or power, and gave him the title of King of East and West. This was brilliant PR. Tughril now had religious legitimacy to go with his military power, which made him much more than just another nomadic conqueror. The Seljuk Empire that Tughril was building was an interesting hybrid. The military and ruling elite were Turkish nomads, but they adopted Persian administrative practices and Islamic religious authority. They patronized Persian culture, built mosques and madrasas, and positioned themselves as defenders of Sunni orthodoxy. This wasn't cynical calculation, though it was certainly politically useful, but reflected genuine conversion and cultural adaptation. The Seljuks were Muslims who took their faith seriously, which was going to make the eventual clash with Christian crusaders particularly intense. Tugril died in 1063, leaving the throne to his nephew Alp Arslan, which means heroic lion in Turkish, and honestly that's such a perfect name for a warrior sultan that it almost seems made up. Alp Arslan was everything you'd want in a medieval ruler if your criteria for excellence was can conquer things effectively. He was a skilled general, a competent administrator, and ambitious enough to keep expanding the empire but smart enough to consolidate his gains. Under his rule, the Seljuk Empire reached its territorial peak and became the dominant power in the Middle East. Alp Arslan's primary targets for expansion were to the west, which meant Byzantine territory. The Byzantine-Seljuk conflict had been building for years, with Turkish raiders penetrating deeper and deeper into Anatolia. These weren't organised invasions initially. They were raids for plunder and slaves, the kind of border violence that had been going on for centuries. But they were getting more frequent and more destructive, and the Byzantines seemed increasingly unable to stop them. The problem from the Byzantine perspective was that their military system was designed for a different kind of warfare. Byzantine armies were built around a core of heavy cavalry, cataphracts, heavily armoured cavalry that could smash through enemy formations, supported by infantry and archers. This worked great against other settled armies that would stand and fight. Against the Seljuks, who refused to stand still and fight like civilized people, from the Byzantine perspective, it was far less effective. The Seljuk strategy was frustratingly simple and devastatingly effective. They would harass Byzantine forces with hit-and-run attacks, shower them with arrows from a distance, and refuse to engage in close combat until the Byzantine army was disorganized and exhausted. If the Byzantines charged, the Seljuks would retreat, then turn and shoot the pursuing troops full of arrows. This is called a feigned retreat, and it's one of the oldest tricks in nomadic warfare, but knowing about it and successfully defending against it are two very different things. The Byzantine Empire's eastern frontier was collapsing through 1,000 cuts. Villages were raided, farmers fled or were captured as slaves, and productive agricultural land was being turned into empty devastation. The theme system, which relied on soldier farmers maintaining their own equipment and fighting to defend their land, broke down completely when those farmers either fled or were killed. Armenian lords who had been Byzantine vassals began making their own accommodations with the Turks, because when the empire can't protect you, you do what you need to survive. By 1068, when Romanos IV Diogenes took the throne, eastern Anatolia was in crisis. Turkish raiders were penetrating as far as the Aegean coast. Cities were being besieged. The empire's revenue from Anatolia, which had been one of its primary sources of wealth and manpower, was drying up. Something needed to be done, and Romanos, to his credit, was determined to do it. Unfortunately, determination doesn't always translate into success, especially when you're working with a broken army and fighting an enemy that refuses to fight on your terms. Romanos launched multiple campaigns into Anatolia in 1068, 1069 and 1070, trying to restore Byzantine control and stop the Turkish raids. But these were temporary fixes, and the underlying problem, that the Seljuks could field large mobile armies and the Byzantines increasingly couldn't, remained unsolved. The Seljuks, for their part, were consolidating their control over the Armenian highlands and pushing into eastern Anatolia with increasing confidence. Alp Arslan had been campaigning in Syria and was actually heading toward Egypt when he heard that Romanos was raising another army. The Sultan decided that the Byzantine problem needed to be dealt with decisively, because having a hostile empire on your border becomes inconvenient when you're trying to conquer other territories. So he turned his army north to meet the Byzantine threat. In the spring of 1071, Romanos assembled what was probably the largest Byzantine army fielded in decades. The sources give wildly different numbers. Medieval chroniclers weren't great with arithmetic and tended to exaggerate army sizes, but it was substantial, possibly 40,000 to 70,000 men. This included Byzantine professional soldiers, various mercenary contingents, and troops from allied or subject peoples. It was a cosmopolitan force with Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, Normans, Franks, and others, which sounds impressive until you realize that getting people who speak different languages and have different military traditions to work together effectively is really, really hard. The army also included a significant contingent of Turkish mercenaries, because the Byzantines had gotten into the habit of hiring Turkish warriors to fight other Turkish warriors. which makes perfect sense until you think about it for more than 5 seconds. These mercenaries were led by a commander who would prove to be spectacularly unreliable at the worst possible moment, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Romanos's plan was straightforward. March into Armenia, relieve the fortress city of Manzikert, which was under Seljuk siege, and force a decisive battle with Alp Arslan's army. This was bold strategy, the kind of thing that works brilliantly in hindsight if you win, and looks catastrophically stupid if you lose. Medieval warfare was full of commanders trying to force decisive battles, because a single victory could potentially end a war and restore your reputation. The problem is that your enemy gets a vote, and sometimes they vote no, I think I'll destroy your army instead. The Byzantine army reached Manzikert in August 1071 and relieved the city. So far so good, one objective achieved. But then Romanos made a crucial decision. He divided his army, sending a detachment to capture another fortress while he continued with the main force. Dividing your army in enemy territory when you know there's a large hostile force somewhere in the area is one of those decisions that military historians love to criticize, usually with phrases like tactically questionable, or strategically inadvisable, or what was he thinking? To be fair to Romanos, he didn't know exactly where Alp Arslan's main army was. The scouting was poor, not surprising given the size of the terrain and the mobility of Turkish forces, and he apparently believed he had time to secure additional fortresses before the main engagement. This turned out to be wrong, because Alp Arslan's army was much closer than anyone realized. When Romanos learned that the Seljuk army was nearby and moving to intercept him, he tried to reunite his divided forces. The detachment he'd sent off was commanded by Tarchaneiots, who decided that discretion was the better part of valor and declined to rejoin the main army. Whether this was cowardice, treachery, or tactical prudence depends on which source you read, but the end result was that Romanos was facing Alp Arslan with a smaller force than he'd planned, and with one of his subordinate commanders essentially deserting. On August 26, 1071, the two armies met on the plain near Manzikert. This is one of those battles where we actually know a fair amount about what happened, because multiple sources describe it from different perspectives. The Byzantine army was arranged in traditional formation, with heavy cavalry on the wings, infantry in the centre, and the emperor commanding from the centre rear. The Seljuk army was, predictably, entirely mounted and considerably more mobile. Alp Arslan allegedly sent envoys to Romanos before the battle, offering peace terms. Whether this was genuine diplomacy or psychological warfare is debatable. Medieval commanders often made peace offers they knew would be rejected just so they could say they'd tried. Romanos rejected the terms, which was probably the right call from his perspective because accepting would have looked like weakness and wouldn't have solved the underlying territorial disputes. So negotiations failed, and both sides prepared for battle. The fighting began in the morning with the Byzantine army advancing. The Seljuks employed their standard tactics, harassing the Byzantine formation with mounted archers, refusing to engage in close combat, and gradually wearing down the enemy. The Byzantine heavy cavalry tried to charge the Turkish lines, but the Turks simply retreated, shot arrows at the pursuing cavalry, and refused to be pinned down. This went on for hours, with the Byzantine army becoming increasingly disorganized and exhausted. The Turkish mercenaries in the Byzantine army, seeing which way the wind was blowing and deciding they had no particular loyalty to Romanos, began deserting to the Seljuk side. This was not ideal. Having a significant portion of your army switch sides mid-battle generally indicates that things are not going according to plan. The Armenian contingents, who had their own complicated relationship with Byzantine authority, also began to waver. By late afternoon, Romanos realized the battle wasn't going well and ordered a retreat to the camp. This is where things went from not great to catastrophic disaster. During the retreat, part of the Byzantine army misunderstood the orders and thought the emperor had been killed. They broke formation and fled, which caused other units to panic and break as well. The organized withdrawal turned into a chaotic rout, and the Seljuk army, sensing victory, pressed their attack with renewed vigor. Romanos, showing considerable personal courage, fought with his rear guard trying to cover the retreat, but the Byzantine army was disintegrating around him. The heavy cavalry that was supposed to be the empire's elite force was scattered. The infantry was being cut down or captured. The emperor's guard was being overwhelmed. At some point in the chaos, the exact details are unclear, Romanos was captured by Seljuk soldiers who allegedly didn't even realize they'd captured the emperor at first. The Battle of Manzikert was a complete and total Byzantine defeat. Exact casualty figures are impossible to determine, but a large portion of the Byzantine army was killed or captured. The emperor himself was a prisoner, which hadn't happened to a Byzantine emperor since Valerian was captured by the Persians in 260 AD, over 800 years earlier. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a psychological and political catastrophe of the First Order. Now here's where the story gets interesting in a historical sense. Alp Arslan's treatment of Romanos was remarkably generous. The Sultan could have executed him, paraded him in chains, or demanded an enormous ransom. Instead, he negotiated a peace treaty with surprisingly reasonable terms. Romanos would be released in exchange for a ransom of 1.5 million gold pieces, a huge sum but not impossibly large, and an annual tribute. The emperor would also cede some frontier territories and provide military assistance when requested. It was a peace treaty between equals, or at least between a victor trying not to be too harsh. There's a famous story, which may or may not be true but is too good not to mention, about Alp Arslan asking Romanos what he would do if their situations were reversed. Romanos allegedly said he would have the Sultan beaten and paraded through Constantinople. Alp Arslan reportedly replied that he would do better, and treated Romanos with honour and respect. Whether this actually happened or was invented later to contrast Islamic mercy with Byzantine cruelty is anyone's guess, but it made for good propaganda. Alp Arslan released Romanos after 8 days of captivity, giving him an escort and gifts. He wasn't being purely altruistic. He wanted a Byzantine emperor who would honour the peace treaty and keep the frontier stable, while he pursued his other territorial ambitions. Alp Arslan, the Sultan, viewed the Byzantines as a problem to be managed, not an empire to be destroyed. This was actually a fairly pragmatic approach to international relations, and if Byzantine court politics hadn't intervened, it might have worked. But Byzantine court politics did intervene, because of course they did. While Romanos had been off losing battles and getting captured, his enemies in Constantinople had been busy. The Ducas family, who had opposed Romanos from the beginning, staged a coup. They declared Romanos deposed and placed Michael VII Ducas, son of Constantine the Vex, on the throne. When Romanos returned to Constantinople expecting to resume his reign, he found the gates closed against him. Romanos tried to resist, raising loyal troops and attempting to march on the capital. It didn't work. He was captured by forces loyal to Michael VII, and then, because Byzantine political culture had some really unpleasant traditions, he was blinded. Not metaphorically blinded by ambition or pride, but literally physically blinded, which was the traditional Byzantine punishment for unsuccessful emperors and pretenders. The procedure was botched. Apparently even blinding people requires some skill, and Romanos died of his injuries in June 1072, less than a year after his capture at Manzikert. So let's sum up the aftermath of Manzikert, because this battle's consequences rippled out for decades. Militarily, the Byzantine Empire lost a large portion of its professional army and its emperor. Politically, it descended into civil war and court intrigue at exactly the moment it needed stability. Economically, the disruption of Anatolian agriculture and trade hurt imperial revenues. Strategically, the defeat opened Anatolia to Turkish settlement in a way that raids never had. Because here's the thing, Alp Arslan didn't actually conquer Byzantine Anatolia after Manzikert. He didn't need to. The Byzantine Empire's internal chaos did the job for him. Turkish tribes began moving into Anatolia not as organised invasion forces, but as settlers taking advantage of Byzantine weakness. Local Byzantine commanders made deals with Turkish leaders, sometimes becoming essentially independent warlords. Armenian princes switched allegiance or played both sides. The administrative structure collapsed, and within a decade most of Anatolia was under Turkish control, not through conquest but through the Byzantine Empire's spectacular failure to hold it together. Alp Arslan himself didn't live long to enjoy his victory. In 1072, just a year after Manzikert, he was murdered by a captured prisoner who he was personally interrogating. The prisoner, according to the sources, managed to stab the Sultan when Alp Arslan got too close, which is a reminder that even if you've just won one of history's decisive battles, you should probably maintain proper security protocols when dealing with captives. The Seljuk throne passed to his son Malik Shah, who would preside over the empire's peak, but the conquest of Anatolia was already well underway by the time of Alp Arslan's death. The Seljuk conquest of Anatolia fundamentally changed the demographics and politics of the region. Areas that had been Greek-speaking and Christian for over 1,000 years began to be Turkish-speaking and Muslim. Cities that had been part of the Byzantine world since ancient times found themselves under Turkish rule. The change wasn't immediate or complete. There would be Christian communities in Anatolia for centuries, and some areas remained contested. But the long-term trajectory was clear. This transformation created the crisis that would lead to the First Crusade. The Byzantine Empire, having lost most of Anatolia, desperately needed military help to recover its lost territories. The Islamic world, having proven it could defeat Byzantine armies in the field, became more confident in its ability to resist Christian military power. And Western Europe, hearing reports of Christian lands falling to Muslim conquerors and pilgrims being mistreated, reports that were often exaggerated but based on real changes, began to see the situation in apocalyptic terms. The Seljuks had reshaped the East just as the chapter title says. They'd created a new empire, destroyed Byzantine control of Anatolia, and set the stage for 2 centuries of conflict between Christianity and Islam in the Middle East. And they'd done it not through some master plan of world conquest, but through a combination of military effectiveness, political opportunism, and Byzantine imperial dysfunction. The stage was set for the Crusades. The Byzantines were desperate for help. The Seljuks controlled the holy sites of Christianity, and Western Europe was about to get involved in Middle Eastern politics in a way that would reshape the medieval world. But before we get to Pope Urban II's speech and the crusading movement itself, we need to understand just how bad things got in Constantinople after Manzikert, because the Byzantine Empire's crisis was about to get much, much worse. So we left the Byzantine Empire in what we might politely call a difficult situation. The army had been destroyed at Manzikert, the emperor had been captured and then blinded by his own people, most of Anatolia was rapidly filling up with Turkish settlers, and the imperial treasury was running on fumes. You might think things couldn't get much worse. You would be wrong, because what the Byzantine Empire really needed at this moment of existential crisis was a solid decade of civil war, coups, counter-coups, and general political chaos that would make a soap opera look understated. The period from 1071 to 1081 represents one of the lowest points in Byzantine history, and given that this is an empire that experienced the sack of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade, that's saying something. It's a decade where the empire essentially tried to commit suicide through internal conflict, while external enemies cheerfully helped themselves to Byzantine territory. If you wanted to write a manual on how to destroy a great power from within, you could just use this decade as your case study. When Michael VII Ducas took the throne in 1071 after overthrowing Romanos IV, he inherited an empire in crisis. The military was shattered, the eastern frontier was collapsing, and the state finances were a disaster. What the empire needed was strong military leadership, fiscal reform, and political stability. What it got was Michael VII, a scholarly emperor who was more interested in philosophy and grammar than warfare and administration. Now, there's nothing wrong with being scholarly. Education is valuable. But when your empire is being invaded from multiple directions, being able to parse ancient Greek syntax doesn't really help with military strategy. Michael VII's nickname was Parapenex, which roughly translates to -1/4, referring to his debasement of the currency. This was economic suicide dressed up as fiscal policy. These are not ideal conditions for holding an empire together. The administration under Michael VII was run by his chief minister, a eunuch named Nicaea, who apparently believed that the empire's problems could be solved through creative taxation and bureaucratic restructuring. This is the medieval equivalent of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic while denying the ship is sinking. Nicaea raised taxes, alienated the landed aristocracy, antagonized the military, and generally made himself the most unpopular man in the empire, which is an impressive achievement when you're competing with the emperor who just debased the currency. The military situation continued to deteriorate. Turkish raiders and settlers were moving into Anatolia with increasing confidence, and the Byzantine Empire seemed incapable of stopping them. Local commanders either fled, made deals with the Turks, or set themselves up as independent warlords. The theme system, which had been the backbone of Byzantine military organization for centuries, was completely broken. Without a functioning army or working administrative structure, the empire's control over its provinces was becoming more theoretical than actual. Meanwhile, other enemies were taking advantage of Byzantine weakness. The Normans in southern Italy, led by Robert Guiscard, whose name means the cunning, and who definitely lived up to it, were consolidating their control over the last Byzantine territories in Italy. The Pechenegs were raiding across the Danube into the Balkans. The Seljuks were expanding their control in the east. It was like the empire was being eaten alive by predators who had realized the Byzantine lion no longer had teeth. By 1078, the empire was so weak that it was experiencing simultaneous rebellions in multiple provinces. Not sequential rebellions that could be dealt with one at a time, simultaneous rebellions because apparently the empire's problems weren't complicated enough already. There were 4 major usurpers at the same time, each claiming to be the legitimate emperor, each with their own army, and each making the situation exponentially worse. The first major rebellion was led by Nikephoros Botaniates, a general in the eastern provinces who decided that he could do a better job than Michael VII, which to be fair was not a high bar to clear. Botaniates was an elderly general, he was probably in his 70s, which by medieval standards was ancient, but he had support from the army and from disgruntled aristocrats who were tired of Nikephoros' administration. He also had the support of Turkish mercenaries, because the Byzantines had apparently learned nothing from recent experience about the potential problems with hiring Turkish soldiers. The second rebellion was led by Nikephoros Bryennios, another general this time in the Balkans. Bryennios also decided he should be emperor, because clearly what the empire needed was more people claiming the throne. He had support from some of the Balkan provinces, and was marching on Constantinople when Botaniates' rebellion kicked off, which created the awkward situation of multiple armies all heading toward the capital, with mutually incompatible goals. The third rebellion was led by Nikephoros Basileus, yet another general. The Byzantine aristocracy really liked the name Nikephoros apparently, who was operating in the Balkans as well. At this point, keeping track of all the Nikephoros rebelling against the empire becomes genuinely confusing, which was probably also confusing for people at the time. Imagine getting news that Nikephoros had rebelled and having to ask which one. The fourth major usurper was Roussel de Bailleul, a Norman mercenary captain who had decided that if everyone else was carving out their own territories, he might as well too. Roussel had been employed by the Byzantine Empire to fight the Turks, see a pattern here, but decided that creating his own principality in Anatolia was more profitable than loyalty to an empire that couldn't pay its bills. He captured the Byzantine general sent to suppress him and briefly set up his own independent state, which lasted until he was defeated by, ironically enough, Turkish mercenaries working for another Byzantine claimant. This situation was absolutely chaotic. You had the legitimate emperor in Constantinople losing authority by the day. You had multiple generals claiming to be the rightful emperor and marching their armies around. You had Turkish mercenaries fighting on multiple sides of multiple civil wars. You had Normans creating independent states. You had the empire's territory shrinking as enemies external and internal helped themselves to provinces. And through all of this, the regular administration was supposed to somehow keep functioning, collect taxes, maintain order, and defend the borders. Unsurprisingly, it didn't work very well. The role of Turkish mercenaries in these civil wars deserves special attention because it's darkly amusing in a historical sense. The Byzantine Empire, having just been defeated by the Seljuk Turks and lost most of Anatolia to Turkish settlement, responded to its civil wars by hiring Turkish mercenaries to fight in those civil wars. This is like your house being robbed and then hiring the robbers' cousins as security guards. These Turkish mercenaries weren't particularly loyal to their Byzantine employers, which shouldn't surprise anyone. They would switch sides based on who paid better, or who looked like they were winning, or just whenever they felt like it. They would raid Byzantine territory even while nominally in Byzantine service, and they would use their employment as an opportunity to scout out targets for later Turkish raids or settlement. The Byzantines were essentially paying for their own destruction, which is impressively dysfunctional even by the standards of failing empires. In 1078, after a siege that was mercifully brief, Constantinople's population wasn't particularly interested in starving for Michael VII. Nikephoros Botaniates entered the capital and became Emperor Nikephoros III. Michael VII, showing good survival instincts, abdicated and retired to a monastery, where he lived quietly for another 20 years. This was actually one of the better outcomes for a deposed Byzantine emperor. He got to keep his eyes and his life, which put him ahead of Romanos IV in the retirement sweepstakes. Nikephoros III's reign from 1078 to 1081 was not exactly a glorious restoration of imperial power. He was old, he was cautious, and he was presiding over an empire that was collapsing faster than he could hold it together. His primary achievement was not making things worse, which by this point was about the best anyone could hope for. The financial situation under Nikephoros III was particularly dire. The treasury was essentially empty. The debased currency had destroyed trade confidence. Tax collection was sporadic at best and impossible in areas that were either in rebellion or under Turkish control. The empire needed money to pay soldiers, but it couldn't pay soldiers without money, and it couldn't get money without soldiers to enforce tax collection. This is what economists would call a suboptimal equilibrium and what everyone else would call completely screwed. The social situation was deteriorating as well. Refugees from Anatolia were flooding into the remaining Byzantine territories, putting pressure on food supplies and urban infrastructure. The agricultural economy was disrupted both by Turkish raids and by Byzantine armies marching back and forth fighting each other. Inflation was rampant due to the currency debasement. The aristocracy was split into rival factions backing different claimants. And the common people, who were bearing the brunt of all this chaos through higher taxes, military conscription, and economic disruption, were understandably unhappy. The military situation continued to worsen. The professional Byzantine army was a shadow of what it had been under Basil II. Most units were undermanned, poorly equipped, and of questionable loyalty. The empire relied increasingly on mercenaries, which was expensive and unreliable. Foreign troops, Normans, Franks, Turks, Slavs, whoever would take Byzantine gold, made up a large portion of the military, and their loyalty lasted exactly as long as the payments, which, given the state of the treasury, wasn't very long. By 1081, it was clear that Nicephorus III's reign was not going to last. He was elderly, he had no clear successor, and his government was losing control. Multiple conspiracies were forming in Constantinople, each planning to overthrow him and install their preferred candidate. One of these conspiracies was led by the Komnenos family, one of the most powerful aristocratic families in the empire, and their candidate was Alexios Komnenos, a young general who had actually shown some competence in the various civil wars and campaigns of the previous decade. Alexios Komnenos was in his mid-20s in 1081, which by Byzantine standards made him practically a child for an emperor, but he had several advantages. He came from a powerful family with extensive connections in the military and aristocracy. He had shown genuine military ability in fighting against Norman mercenaries and in various campaigns. He was energetic and ambitious. And perhaps most importantly, he was backed by his mother, Anna Damascene, who was one of those formidable Byzantine matriarchs who could organize a conspiracy, manage court politics, and probably negotiate trade treaties while simultaneously planning dinner for 50. You did not want to be on Anna Damascene's bad side. The conspiracy to put Alexios on the throne was organized by his older brother Isaac Komnenos, and supported by key military commanders, aristocratic families, and importantly the palace guard. In Byzantine politics, having the palace guard on your side was crucial. They controlled access to the emperor and could make or break a coup attempt. The conspirators also secured the support of various mercenary commanders, because in the Byzantine Empire of 1081, nothing happened without mercenaries being involved somehow. In April 1081, the conspiracy made its move. Alexios and his supporters gathered their troops outside Constantinople and prepared to assault the capital. Nicephorus III, who probably saw this coming but was too old and tired to effectively resist, attempted to negotiate. These negotiations went nowhere, partly because Alexios wanted the throne, and partly because Nicephorus's political support had evaporated. When it became clear that the emperor couldn't rely on the army, the palace guard, or even most of the aristocracy, he agreed to abdicate. On April 4th, 1081, Alexios Komnenos entered Constantinople and was crowned Emperor Alexios III. Nicephorus III, following the recent tradition of Byzantine emperors who wanted to keep their eyes and their lives, retired to a monastery. This was the third emperor in a decade, and the empire had burned through more rulers than some modern democracies. But Alexios would prove to be different from his immediate predecessors. He would rule for 37 years, restore at least some of the empire's strength, and his appeal for military help would lead directly to the First Crusade. However, the empire that Alexios inherited was barely recognizable as the superpower that Basil VI had left in 1025. In just over 50 years, the Byzantine Empire had lost most of Anatolia, its Italian territories, effective control over the Balkans, and vast amounts of revenue. The population had declined through warfare, disease, and economic disruption. The military was broken. The currency was worthless. The administration was corrupt. And the empire was surrounded by enemies on every side, all of whom saw Byzantine weakness as an opportunity. Let's take stock of exactly how bad things were in 1081, because it's important to understand the depth of the crisis. In Anatolia, Turkish emirates and tribal groups controlled most of the interior and were pushing toward the Aegean coast. The Byzantine Empire held only scattered coastal cities and fortresses, and even these were under constant pressure. The productive agricultural lands that had supported the empire for centuries were either depopulated, turned into pasture by Turkish nomads, or controlled by hostile forces. The theme system, which had organized military defense for hundreds of years, was completely defunct in Anatolia. In the Balkans, the situation was only marginally better. The Pechenegs were raiding south of the Danube. Various Slavic groups were essentially independent. Norman mercenaries and adventurers were carving out their own territories. The Via Egnatia, the great road connecting Constantinople to the Adriatic, was only sporadically under imperial control. The empire's ability to defend or even administer the Balkans was severely limited. In southern Italy, the last Byzantine possessions had fallen to the Normans. Robert Guiscard controlled everything from Calabria to Apulia and was looking across the Adriatic at Byzantine territories in the Balkans. The Normans were excellent warriors, skilled administrators, and worryingly ambitious. They'd conquered southern Italy from the Byzantines, conquered Sicily from the Arabs, and showed no signs of stopping. They were basically the overachievers of 11th century military expansion. The economic situation was catastrophic. The debased currency had destroyed trade confidence. Italian merchants, particularly from Venice and Genoa, were increasingly dominating Mediterranean trade, bypassing Byzantine control and taking the profits. Tax revenue had collapsed in areas under Turkish control or in rebellion. The empire's traditional sources of wealth, agricultural production in Anatolia, trade through Constantinople, customs revenues from international commerce, were all severely diminished. The treasury was empty, debts were mounting, and the empire couldn't pay its soldiers, bureaucrats, or anyone else. The military was perhaps the most urgent problem. The professional Byzantine army that had conquered Bulgaria and fought the Arabs was gone, destroyed through decades of neglect, civil war, and defeat. The empire had perhaps 5,000 reliable native troops in 1081, compared to the tens of thousands Basil II had commanded. Everything else was mercenaries, and mercenaries only fight when paid, which the empire couldn't afford to do consistently. The navy, once supreme in the Mediterranean, was reduced to a handful of ships and couldn't even protect coastal cities from raids. The diplomatic situation was equally dire. The split with Rome in 1054 meant the Byzantine Empire couldn't expect help from Western Europe. Or rather, any help would come with strings attached and complicated religious conditions. The Islamic world was divided but increasingly unified under Seljuk authority. The empire had no reliable allies and was surrounded by enemies or opportunistic neighbours who were just waiting for the right moment to grab more territory. Population decline was a serious issue as well. War, disease, economic disruption, and refugee movements had significantly reduced the population in many areas. Cities, farmland was going out of cultivation. The demographic base that supported the empire's wealth and military power was eroding. This wasn't something that could be fixed quickly. Rebuilding a population takes generations. The administrative apparatus was still functioning, sort of, but it was riddled with corruption and inefficiency. Government positions were routinely sold to the highest bidder. Officials at every level were extracting bribes and skimming revenues. The legal system was politicized and unreliable. Provincial governance was weak or non-existent in many areas. The bureaucracy that had been Rome's great contribution to governance had become a parasitic system that took more than it gave. So this was the empire Alexios I inherited in April 1081. Broke, militarily impotent, territorially reduced, diplomatically isolated, administratively dysfunctional, and facing threats on every border. If you were writing a strategic assessment, you would probably conclude that the Byzantine Empire was finished, and it was just a matter of time before it collapsed completely. Many contemporary observers did reach exactly that conclusion. But here's the thing about Byzantine history. The empire had an almost supernatural ability to survive crises that would have destroyed other states. It had survived the Arab conquests in the 7th century, the iconoclastic controversy, multiple civil wars, economic crises, military disasters, and countless other challenges. The Byzantines were the cockroaches of medieval empires. No matter how many times you thought they were finished, they somehow survived and came back. Alexios I would prove this once again. His immediate priorities were survival and stabilization. He needed to secure Constantinople against immediate threats, restore at least minimal military capability, somehow find money to pay soldiers and officials, and start rebuilding the empire's shattered power. He would spend his entire reign working on these goals, with varying degrees of success. And in pursuing these goals, he would make a decision that would change medieval history. He would send envoys to Western Europe asking for military assistance against the Turks. But between Alexios' accession in 1081 and Urban's speech in 1095, there were 14 years of Byzantine survival, rebuilding, and desperate diplomacy. The empire wasn't saved yet. It wouldn't truly be saved until well into Alexios' reign. But it had found a leader who might be capable of pulling it back from the brink. The civil war period from 1071 to 1081 had been an unmitigated disaster for the Byzantine Empire. It had lost territory, prestige, military power, economic strength, and political stability. It had demonstrated an impressive capacity for self-destruction, with Byzantine generals fighting each other while enemies conquered Byzantine territory. It had hired Turkish mercenaries to fight in civil wars during a period when Turkish conquest was the empire's primary existential threat. It had debased its currency, alienated its aristocracy, exhausted its population, and burned through emperors at an alarming rate. But it had survived. Barely shakily desperately, but it had survived. The Byzantine Empire in 1081 was a shadow of what it had been in 1025, but it still existed, still controlled Constantinople and the Straits, still had a functioning government and administration, and still had the potential to recover. Whether it would actually recover was an open question, but at least now it had an emperor who seemed capable of attempting the recovery. Alexios would reign until 1118, spending nearly 4 decades trying to restore Byzantine power. He would fight the Normans, negotiate with the Turks, manage complex diplomatic relations with crusaders who often didn't understand or respect Byzantine interests, and generally try to hold together an empire that by all rights should have collapsed. His reign would see the First Crusade and its aftermath, the establishment of crusader states in the Levant, continued Turkish pressure in Anatolia, and the slow, painful rebuilding of Byzantine military and economic power. But in 1081 all of that was in the future. What mattered immediately was survival, and Alexios had barely secured his throne when he faced an invasion from Robert Guiscard's Normans. The crisis wasn't over, it was just entering a new phase. The civil wars had ended, but the external threats remained as dangerous as ever. And in the Byzantine Empire was down but not yet out. The next 14 years would determine whether it could recover enough to survive as a great power, or whether it would continue its decline into irrelevance. And the decision to ask for Western military help, which seemed like a reasonable idea at the time, would have consequences that no one in 1081 could possibly have anticipated. The stage was set for the First Crusade, though none of the major players knew it yet. Now, before we get to the dramatic moment of Pope Urban II standing up and launching the Crusades, we need to talk about something that medieval people couldn't have understood, but that modern historians absolutely obsess over: climate change. Not the kind we worry about today, but the medieval warm period, and more specifically, how it was making Europe more prosperous while simultaneously making the Middle East more miserable. Because nothing sets the stage for a massive military expedition quite like good weather at home and bad weather where you're planning to invade. The medieval warm period, roughly from 950 to 1250 AD, was a time when global temperatures were somewhat higher than the preceding centuries. Now, we're not talking about dramatic warming, this wasn't the ice caps melting or anything apocalyptic, but temperatures were warm enough to make a noticeable difference in agricultural productivity, especially in northern Europe. In England, people were growing wine grapes successfully, which if you've ever tasted English wine from colder periods, you'll appreciate was actually impressive. The Vikings were establishing settlements in Greenland, which despite its optimistic name, is not exactly prime real estate, but during the medieval warm period it was at least marginally habitable. For West, longer growing seasons meant more food production. More food production meant population growth. Population growth meant more people, which in a feudal society meant more peasants to work the land, more soldiers to fight wars, and more surplus sons of nobles who wouldn't inherit land and needed something to do with their lives besides causing trouble locally. The population of Europe was expanding at a rate not seen since the Roman Empire, and all those extra people needed somewhere to go and something to do. Agricultural innovations were helping too. The heavy plough, which could turn over the dense clay soils of northern Europe, was becoming more widespread. The three-field system, where you rotated crops through 3 fields instead of 2, was increasing productivity. Horse collars that didn't choke the horse were making ploughing more efficient. Watermills and windmills were reducing the human labour needed for grinding grain. All of these innovations, combined with better weather, meant that Europe was producing more food per acre than ever before, which sounds great until you realise what medieval Europe traditionally did with surplus resources: war. But here's where it gets interesting from a crusading perspective. While Europe was enjoying this agricultural boom, the Middle East was experiencing the opposite. The same warming that benefited northern Europe caused drought conditions in the eastern Mediterranean and Middle East. The climate systems that bring rain to these regions were disrupted, and areas that had been agriculturally productive for millennia were experiencing regular droughts and crop failures. This wasn't a disaster on the scale of the Bronze Age collapse, but it was causing serious economic and social stress. The Seljuk conquests, which we talked about earlier, were happening during a period of climate stress in the Middle East. Now, I'm not saying climate change caused the Seljuk expansion, that's too simplistic, but it certainly didn't help stability in the region. When you have droughts affecting agricultural production, food prices rise, governments struggle to feed cities, and populations become restless. Add nomadic warriors looking for new pastures and you have a recipe for conflict and displacement. The Byzantine Empire, caught between these climate zones, was experiencing its own problems. Anatolia, which had been the empire's breadbasket, was not only being conquered by the Seljuks, but also experiencing reduced agricultural productivity due to climate variation. The refugee populations fleeing Turkish advance were moving into areas that couldn't easily support them. Then came the plague years of 1092 to 1095 and things got dramatically worse. Now, when we say plague in a medieval context, we need to be careful because medieval people called lots of different diseases plague. This wasn't the Black Death that would devastate Europe in the 14th century. That particular nightmare was still 2 centuries away, but it was serious enough. The disease, whatever it was specifically, probably some combination of typhus, dysentery, and other epidemic diseases that thrive when people are malnourished and living in crowded conditions, swept through Europe and the Middle East with devastating effect. The plague hit hardest in 1094 and 1095, right before Urban II's speech at Clermont. The timing here is not coincidental. Epidemics have a way of making people think about mortality, sin, and the afterlife, which from a religious perspective means they start taking religion very seriously. When 1 in 10 people in your village dies of disease, you start wondering if God is angry and what you might do to fix that. Medieval Christianity had a ready answer: penance, pilgrimage, and demonstrating your faith through action. The disease was particularly bad in urban areas, where crowding and poor sanitation, not that medieval sanitation was good anywhere, but cities were especially problematic, allowed diseases to spread rapidly. Constantinople, with its population of several 100,000 crammed into a relatively small area, experienced severe outbreaks. Italian cities were hit hard. Even smaller towns and villages weren't spared, though their lower population density meant the spread was somewhat slower. The economic impact of the plague years was substantial. Dead farmers don't harvest crops, sick workers don't produce goods, and terrified merchants don't travel to plague-infected cities. Trade was disrupted, labour shortages drove up wages while food shortages drove up prices, and the overall economy contracted. Governments that were already struggling financially, like the Byzantine Empire, found their revenues declining just when they needed money most. The plague made everything worse, which is generally what plagues do. Medieval people didn't understand germ theory or epidemiology. They couldn't see bacteria or viruses. Their medical understanding was based on the theory of humours, miasmas, and divine punishment. When plague struck, the logical explanation from their perspective was that God was angry and punishing humanity for its sins. This wasn't superstition. It was the best explanation available given their scientific understanding. And if God was angry, the solution was to appease God through religious devotion and action. Popular religious movements were spreading through Europe in the 1090s, and many of them had an apocalyptic tinge. Preachers were warning that the end times were approaching, that Christ would return soon, and that Christians needed to prepare their souls. The year 1100 was approaching, not as significant as 1000 AD had been, but still a round number that encouraged eschatological speculation. The fall of Jerusalem to the Seljuks, the plague, the political chaos, all of this could be read as signs of the apocalypse if you were inclined to see it that way, and many people were. There was also a growing emphasis on pilgrimage as a form of religious devotion. Pilgrimage had always been important in medieval Christianity, but it was becoming increasingly popular in the late 11th century. Pilgrims would travel to holy sites, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Rome, and most prestigiously Jerusalem, as an act of penance and devotion. The journey was dangerous and expensive, which apparently made it more spiritually valuable. The logic was that suffering for your faith demonstrated genuine devotion and could earn you salvation, or at least reduce your time in purgatory. The problem was that by the 1090s, pilgrimage to Jerusalem had become significantly more difficult and dangerous. The Seljuk conquest had disrupted the previous arrangements where Muslim rulers tolerated Christian pilgrims. Reports were filtering back to Europe, many exaggerated, some accurate, of pilgrims being robbed, harassed, or killed. The Holy Sepulchre was supposedly desecrated. Christians in the East were suffering under Muslim rule. Whether these reports were entirely true is less important than the fact that people believed them and were outraged by them. The cult of relics was also intensifying during this period. Medieval Christians believed that physical objects associated with saints, bones, clothing, personal items, retained spiritual power and could perform miracles. Churches competed to acquire relics, and pilgrims flocked to see them. The ultimate relic destination was Jerusalem, site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, where the very ground was holy. The idea that this holiest of holy places was under Muslim control and supposedly being defiled was deeply offensive to medieval Christian sensibilities. Peace and truce of God movements had been spreading through Europe, attempting to limit feudal warfare and protect non-combatants. The Church had been trying to channel the violence of the warrior aristocracy into less destructive directions, with limited success. Knights were expected to protect the weak, defend the Church, and fight only when necessary, but in practice they fought pretty much whenever they wanted, and for whatever reason seemed good at the moment. The Church needed a way to redirect all this military energy toward approved targets, and a war against Muslims to reclaim Jerusalem was looking like the perfect solution. The rise of monasticism and religious reform movements was creating a more militant Christianity. The Cluniac reforms had emphasized strict religious observance and papal authority. New military religious orders were being proposed, the concept of warrior monks who would fight for Christ while maintaining monastic discipline. There was also a generational factor at work. These were men trained for warfare from childhood, but with no productive outlet for their military skills and no prospects for establishing themselves. They were basically armed, trained and unemployed, which is not a stable social situation. A religious war offered them the possibility of land, wealth, glory and spiritual salvation all at once. The political situation in Western Europe was relatively stable by 1095, which meant that rulers could afford to send troops abroad. The major conflicts that had dominated earlier in the century, the investiture controversy between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, various succession disputes, Viking raids, had mostly been resolved or stabilized. France was fragmented but peaceful. England was secure under Norman rule. Germany was dealing with internal issues but wasn't in open warfare. Spain was focused on the Reconquista but had troops to spare. Italy's city-states were prosperous and could fund military expeditions. For the first time in generations, Western Europe had the stability and resources to project military power outside its borders. The development of heavy cavalry as the dominant military force created a class of professional warriors who were expensive to maintain and needed to justify their social position through military success. Knights were the medieval equivalent of main battle tanks, hugely expensive, requiring years of training, and absolutely devastating in the right circumstances. But they needed wars to fight, because a knight who never fought was just an expensive burden on society. The Crusades would give thousands of knights a purpose, and a war that was both militarily challenging and spiritually rewarding. Popular preaching was spreading the message that action was needed. Wandering preachers, many of them unauthorized by the church hierarchy, were drawing crowds with their calls for religious renewal and dramatic action. These preachers tapped into popular anxieties about plague, sin, and salvation, and they promised that God would reward those who took up arms for the faith. The official church sometimes tried to control these popular movements, but often ended up channeling them instead. The economic situation was creating both means and motive for a crusade. The population boom and agricultural surplus meant that Europe could afford to send tens of thousands of people on a military expedition without collapsing economically. The expansion of trade and commerce meant there was liquid wealth that could fund the expedition, and the younger sons and landless knights who made up much of the military class had economic motives to go. Land and wealth in the East looked attractive when you had no prospects at home. All of these factors, climate change benefiting Europe while hurting the Middle East, plague creating apocalyptic anxieties, popular religious fervour, an available warrior class looking for purpose, relative political stability, economic surplus, and growing outrage over the situation in Jerusalem were converging in the early 1090s. It was like someone was building a bonfire and just waiting for a spark to set it off. That spark would come from Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont in November 1095. But before we get to that moment, it's worth understanding just how unusual this situation was. The medieval world wasn't usually organised or stable enough to launch the kind of massive, coordinated military expedition that the First Crusade would become. The fact that it happened at all required a specific constellation of circumstances, demographic, economic, political, religious, and even climatic, that rarely aligned. The First Crusade wasn't inevitable. It was the result of multiple overlapping crises and opportunities that created a unique historical moment. In March 1095, Alexios de Komnenos sent envoys to the Council of Piacenza in northern Italy. The council was a gathering of church officials called by Pope Urban II to discuss various ecclesiastical matters: church reform, clerical celibacy, the usual 11th century church business that kept prelates busy. The Byzantine envoys had a more urgent message. The empire needed military help against the Turkish threat, and they were appealing to the Pope and Western Christianity for assistance. This wasn't the first time the Byzantines had asked for help. Alexios had been sending diplomatic feelers to the west since taking the throne in 1081. But this was the first time the request was made at a major church council with the Pope present, which gave it official weight and publicity. The envoys described the Turkish conquest of Anatolia, the suffering of Eastern Christians under Muslim rule, and the threat to Constantinople itself. They painted a picture of Christianity under siege and implied that if the East fell, the West would be next. Urban II was receptive to this appeal for several reasons. First, he was French by birth, born Odo of Lagari, and had connections to the French aristocracy, who would form the core of the crusading army. He understood the political and military capabilities of Western European knights. Second, he was involved in a political struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV over the investiture controversy, and a successful crusade would enhance papal prestige and authority. Third, he genuinely believed in the spiritual value of defending Christianity and saw an opportunity to unite Eastern and Western Christians under papal leadership. But Urban didn't immediately call for a crusade at Piacenza. Instead, he promised to consider the request and take it up at a later council. This was smart politics. He needed time to plan, to build support among the Western European nobility, and to figure out how to present this appeal in a way that would generate the response he wanted. He spent the next several months travelling through France, meeting with nobles, assessing support, and preparing the ground for what would be one of history's most consequential speeches. The Council of Clermont was called for November 1095. Clermont was a city in south-central France, in the Auvergne region, far from the major political centres but accessible to French nobles and clergy. The council was officially about church reform and discipline, but everyone knew the main event would be the Pope's address about the situation in the East. Word had spread through networks of nobles and clergy that something significant was being planned. The council Urban spent the first week dealing with church business, settling disputes, issuing decrees, excommunicating various people who had annoyed the church. This was standard council procedure, the ecclesiastical equivalent of handling routine business before getting to the main agenda item. The anticipation was building, because everyone knew Urban was going to address the question of military aid to the East. On November 27, 1095, a date that would become one of the most significant in medieval history, Urban II gave his speech. We don't have the exact words he used, because nobody was recording speeches verbatim in the 11th century. We have several later accounts, written by chroniclers who weren't present but who recorded what they heard from people who were, or what they thought should have been said, or what they wanted posterity to believe was said. These accounts differ in details but agree on the basic message and its revolutionary impact. Urban spoke outside the cathedral because the expected crowd was too large for the building. He was speaking to nobles and knights as much as to clergy. The crowd that gathered was in the thousands, a huge assembly for a medieval city, indicating that word had spread and people knew something important was happening. The speech began with a description of the suffering of Eastern Christians under Turkish rule. Urban described how the Turks had conquered Byzantine territory, how they were desecrating churches, persecuting Christians, and advancing toward Constantinople. He called the Turks barbarous invaders who were destroying Christian civilization. This played into existing European prejudices about Muslims and Eastern peoples, and it framed the conflict as a defensive war to protect Christianity rather than an aggressive invasion. Then Urban pivoted to Jerusalem. He described how the Holy City, the site of Christ's passion and resurrection, was under Muslim control. He talked about how Christian pilgrims were being harassed and prevented from visiting the holy sites. He painted a picture of the holiest places in Christianity being defiled by infidels. This was the emotional core of the speech, not abstract concerns about Byzantine territorial integrity, but the concrete reality that Jerusalem, the spiritual center of Christianity, was controlled by Muslims. Urban's genius was in connecting the Byzantine request for military aid with the popular desire for pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He didn't just ask nobles to help the Byzantines defend Anatolia. That would have been a political favor to a distant empire that most Western Europeans didn't particularly like or trust. Instead, he called for an armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem, a military expedition whose goal was to liberate the Holy City and make it safe for Christian pilgrims. This was something that Western Europeans could understand and support emotionally. The concept of armed pilgrimage was revolutionary. Traditionally, pilgrimage was a peaceful act of individual devotion. Urban was proposing something entirely new, a mass military pilgrimage where the pilgrims would fight their way to Jerusalem. The army would be the pilgrims, and the pilgrimage would be a war. This combined two activities, warfare and pilgrimage, that had traditionally been separate, and the combination was explosive. Urban offered something unprecedented, the plenary indulgence. He declared that anyone who went on this armed pilgrimage with the right spiritual motives, specifically devotion to God rather than worldly gain, would have all their sins forgiven. Not just reduced time in purgatory, not just partial forgiveness, but complete remission of all sins. This was an extraordinary promise, effectively offering guaranteed salvation to anyone who took up the cross. For medieval Christians who genuinely believed in heaven, hell, and the terrifying possibility of eternal damnation, this was an offer almost impossible to refuse. The plenary indulgence solved a major theological problem that had plagued medieval Christianity. How could warriors, whose profession involved killing people, achieve salvation? The Church taught "thou shalt not kill," but it also recognized that society needed warriors to maintain order and defend against enemies. Various theological arguments had been developed to justify warfare under certain circumstances, but it remained morally problematic. Urban's indulgence cut through all that complexity. If you fought in this particular war for this particular cause, your sins would be forgiven regardless of what you did. This was theologically radical and spiritually attractive. Urban also emphasized that this was a war authorized by God. He wasn't just asking people to fight, he was telling them that God wanted them to fight, that this was divine will, that they would be doing God's work by taking up arms against the Muslims. This transformed the expedition from a military campaign into a holy war, a concept that was familiar from the ongoing Reconquista in Spain, but hadn't been applied to the Eastern Mediterranean before. By framing it as God's will, Urban gave the crusade a religious legitimacy that made it feel both righteous and necessary. The practical details were kept somewhat vague, which was probably intentional. Urban didn't specify exactly when the army should leave, what route it should take, or who should lead it. He appointed Bishop Adhema of Le Puy as his papal legate to accompany the expedition, providing spiritual leadership and ensuring church oversight. But the military organization was left to the nobles who would participate. This flexibility allowed different groups to organize independently and depart on their own schedules, which would later cause coordination problems, but in the moment made it easier for diverse groups to participate. The immediate response to Urban's speech was extraordinary. According to the chroniclers, the crowd began shouting "Deus vult," God wills it, which became the crusading cry. People began sewing crosses onto their clothing on the spot, symbolizing their commitment to the pilgrimage. The cross became the symbol of the entire movement. Participants were taking up the cross. The expedition became the crusade, from the Latin cruciata, meaning marked with a cross, and crusaders wore crosses to identify themselves and their purpose. Nobles present at Clermont began pledging to go. Raymond of Toulouse, one of the most powerful nobles in southern France, was among the first to take the cross. Adhema of Le Puy, the papal legate, obviously committed. Others followed, and the movement spread rapidly as news of Urban's speech travelled through France and beyond. The combination of religious fervour, promise of salvation, desire for adventure, and possibility of wealth created a powerful motivational mix that appealed to people across social classes. Urban spent the following months travelling through France, preaching the crusade, meeting with nobles, and building support. He visited monasteries and cathedrals, held smaller councils, and everywhere emphasized the spiritual rewards and military necessity of the expedition. He authorized other preachers to spread the message, and the crusading movement took on a life of its own. Local priests preached to their congregations, nobles recruited their vassals, and the message spread through social networks faster than Urban could have travelled himself. The response went far beyond what Urban had anticipated or intended. He had envisioned an expedition of perhaps a few thousand knights who would reinforce the Byzantine army and help reclaim Anatolia. What he got was a mass movement involving tens of thousands of people, not just knights but also common soldiers, peasants, women, children, non-combatants of all kinds. The People's Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit, would depart in spring 1096, months before the organised armies were ready. This popular crusade would be a disaster, but it showed the power of the movement Urban had unleashed. The organised expeditions by major nobles, which we'll discuss in detail later, wouldn't depart until August 1096, nearly a year after Urban's speech. This delay was necessary for the nobles to prepare, raise funds, organise logistics, and gather their forces. Medieval military expeditions required enormous preparation. You couldn't just decide to march thousands of people across Europe and the Middle East without serious planning. The fact that multiple large armies eventually assembled and actually made it to Jerusalem is a testament to the organisational capabilities of 11th century European society. Urban's vision for the Crusade was both spiritual and political. Spiritually, it would unite Christianity against a common enemy, heal the schism between East and West, extend papal authority over Eastern churches, and demonstrate Christian military power. Politically, it would enhance papal prestige, give restless knights a productive outlet for their energy, strengthen ties between the papacy and European nobility, and potentially create opportunities for territorial expansion. The fact that almost none of these goals would be achieved in the way Urban intended doesn't diminish the revolutionary nature of what he started. The concept of crusading, holy war authorized by the Pope, offering spiritual rewards, combining pilgrimage with military action, would become one of the defining features of the high medieval period. The First Crusade was just the beginning. There would be 8 major crusades over the next 2 centuries, plus numerous smaller expeditions, ongoing military orders, and a permanent crusading movement in the Mediterranean. The crusading ideal would influence European politics, religion, and culture for generations. And it all started with Urban II's speech at Clermont in November 1095. But in the moment, standing outside the cathedral in Clermont with the crowd shouting Deus vult and people rushing to sew crosses on their clothing, none of the long-term consequences were clear. What was clear was that something unprecedented was happening. A mass movement had been born, combining religious fervour with military ambition, promising salvation through warfare, and directing the energy of Western European society toward the East. The Crusade had begun, even though no armies had yet marched. The message would spread throughout Western Europe over the winter of 1095-1096. In France, Germany, Italy, and beyond, people heard about Urban's call and responded. The motivations varied. Some were genuinely pious, seeking salvation and spiritual renewal. Some were adventurous, seeking glory and excitement. Some were landless, seeking territory and wealth. Some were criminals, seeking redemption or escape from punishment. Some were simply swept up in the mass enthusiasm and didn't fully understand what they were getting into. But they all took up the cross, and they all began preparing for the journey to Jerusalem. The stage was set for one of the most consequential military expeditions in history. Multiple armies would converge on Constantinople, march across Anatolia, besiege great cities, fight desperate battles, and eventually, against enormous odds, capture Jerusalem. The journey would take 3 years and claim tens of thousands of lives. It would reshape the political map of the Middle East, create new states, destroy old empires, and begin 2 centuries of conflict between Christianity and Islam. But in November 1095, it was just a speech, a promise, and a crowd of people shouting that God willed it. Sometimes, that's all it takes to change the world. So Urban II had unleashed this massive religious movement, and he probably expected that the actual crusading would be organised by the nobility, the people with money, weapons, training, and at least some understanding of logistics and military strategy. What he didn't anticipate was that the message would resonate so powerfully with common people that they'd decide to start their own crusade immediately, without waiting for the nobles to get organised. This was not a great idea, but nobody was asking for organisational advice. The leader of this popular movement was a monk named Peter, who would become known as Peter the Hermit. Now he was more of a freelance preacher, the medieval equivalent of a viral internet personality, except instead of Instagram followers, he had thousands of peasants who believed he had visions from God. Peter was apparently a compelling speaker with genuine charisma, able to move crowds to religious fervour with his preaching. He was also, as events would demonstrate, completely unqualified to lead a military expedition. Peter claimed to have previously travelled to Jerusalem on pilgrimage and witnessed the suffering of Christians under Muslim rule. Whether this was true or a compelling backstory he invented is debatable. Medieval chroniclers weren't great at fact-checking, and a good origin story was more important than strict accuracy. What mattered was that people believed him, and when he preached about liberating Jerusalem, crowds gathered. He described his vision of Christ calling Christians to rescue the Holy Land, and people responded with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for religious ecstasy or mass hysteria. Often both. By early 1096, Peter was travelling through France and Germany with a growing army of followers. These weren't knights and nobles, they were peasants, urban poor, landless labourers, and people from the lower rungs of medieval society who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from the promise of salvation and possible material rewards. There were some minor knights and lesser nobles mixed in, because even poor nobility could get swept up in religious enthusiasm, but the vast majority were commoners with no military training whatsoever. The problem with an army of untrained peasants is that they're not actually an army in any meaningful sense. They had no cavalry, limited weapons, mostly farm tools and clubs, no armour, no military discipline, and no supply chain. What they had was religious conviction and the belief that God would provide. This is admirable from a faith perspective, but problematic from a military logistics perspective. You cannot sustain an army of thousands of people on faith alone. They need food, water, shelter, and at some point actual weapons if they're planning to fight anyone. Peter's mob, and let's be honest, it was a mob more than an army, began moving east in April 1096. They were supposed to be heading to Constantinople to link up with the Byzantine forces, but first they had to get through Central Europe, and this is where things started going wrong immediately. Feeding several thousand people as you march through someone else's territory requires either bringing provisions or buying food locally. Peter's followers had almost no money, no supply wagons, and apparently no plan beyond march toward Jerusalem and God will provide. The result was predictable. They looted. As they passed through Germany and Hungary, they took food from local populations, sometimes by force, sometimes by simply overwhelming villages with their numbers. Local authorities tried to control them with limited success. The Crusaders, if we can call them that, were operating under the assumption that they were doing God's work and therefore entitled to whatever they needed. The local populations, who were Christian but not particularly interested in feeding thousands of uninvited guests, disagreed strongly. Then came the Rhineland pogroms, and this is where the People's Crusade turned from chaotic to horrific. In May and June 1096, groups of crusaders in the Rhineland region of Germany attacked Jewish communities in cities including Speyer, Worms, Mainz, and Cologne. The logic, if you can call it that, was that if they were going to fight non-Christians in the Holy Land, why not start with non-Christians closer to home? This was not official crusade policy. Urban II had never called for attacks on Jews, and local bishops tried to protect Jewish communities. But it happened anyway, driven by religious zealotry, economic resentment, and the kind of mob violence that emerges when large groups of people convince themselves that atrocity is righteousness. The massacres were brutal. Jewish communities who had lived in these cities for generations and contributed to the local economy were given the choice of conversion or death. Many chose death rather than abandon their faith. Some bishops tried to shelter Jews in their palaces or churches, but the crusader mobs broke in anyway. The estimated death toll was in the thousands, making this one of the worst anti-Jewish massacres of the medieval period up to that point. It was a horrifying preview of the religious violence that would characterize much of crusading history. The leaders of these attacks weren't Peter the Hermit himself. He was ahead of these groups, already into Hungary, but other preachers and minor nobles who had taken up the cross and apparently decided that murder was an acceptable form of religious devotion. Names like Emicho of Flonheim appear in the chronicles as leaders of these attacks, though the details are murky, and the sources are often written by Christians who either approved of the massacres or were embarrassed by them, neither of which makes for objective historical reporting. The pogroms were eventually stopped by local authorities and church officials, but the damage was done. Entire Jewish communities were destroyed. The economic disruption was significant. Jews were important in trade and finance, and killing them wasn't just morally wrong, but economically stupid. And it demonstrated that the crusading movement, for all its spiritual rhetoric about liberating Jerusalem, could easily turn into an excuse for violence against anyone deemed an enemy of Christianity. This pattern would repeat throughout the Crusades. Meanwhile, Peter the Hermit's main group had made it through Hungary, though not without incident. They'd clashed with Hungarian authorities, looted settlements, and generally made themselves unwelcome. By the time they reached the Byzantine border, the Byzantines were already receiving reports that a huge, uncontrolled mob was heading their way, and the reports were not reassuring. Emperor Alexios I, who had asked for military help, was probably expecting professional soldiers under noble command who would integrate with Byzantine forces. What he got was Peter the Hermit leading thousands of peasants who couldn't follow orders, had no discipline, and were already leaving a trail of chaos across Europe. It's like ordering a security company and getting a flash mob instead. Peter's crusaders arrived in Constantinople in August 1096. Alexios met with Peter and was apparently unimpressed. The emperor provided supplies and advice, specifically that they should wait for the main crusading armies with their professional soldiers before attempting to cross into Turkish-controlled Anatolia. This was excellent advice, the kind of strategic wisdom gained from centuries of Byzantine military experience. Peter's followers ignored it completely. After camping outside Constantinople and causing problems with the local population, there were incidents of looting and violence. The Crusaders demanded to be ferried across the Bosporus into Anatolia. He transported them across the strait and into Asia Minor, where they would be the Turks' problem instead of his. This was pragmatic but not particularly ethical. Alexios knew these people were marching to their deaths, but at least they wouldn't die in Byzantine territory causing diplomatic incidents. Once in Anatolia, the People's Crusade fractured almost immediately. Peter tried to maintain control and urge caution, but significant portions of his mob decided they didn't need to wait for anything. They split into multiple groups, some following minor leaders, some just wandering around looking for Turks to fight or settlements to loot. Military discipline, which had been minimal to begin with, completely evaporated. One group, predominantly German crusaders, raided into Turkish territory and actually captured a small fortress near Nicaea. Encouraged by this minor success, which was more Turkish surprise at their audacity than actual military achievement, they got ambitious. Another group, predominantly French, decided they needed to do something more impressive. The two groups were competing for glory, because apparently military effectiveness was less important than ethnic pride. In late September 1096, a large contingent of French crusaders marched toward Nicaea itself, the Seljuk capital in the region. This was fantastically stupid. Nicaea was a fortified city held by a strong Turkish garrison, and the crusaders had no siege equipment, no military training, and no realistic chance of capturing it. They were also marching directly into Turkish-controlled territory, without scouts, without a supply line, and without any apparent awareness that the Turkish army might object to their presence. The Turkish forces, commanded by the local Sultan Kilij Arslan, couldn't believe their luck. The Crusaders had conveniently gathered themselves in the open, far from any Byzantine support, with no fortifications or defensive position. The Turks ambushed them near a village called Sivto on October 21st, 1096. It wasn't really a battle, it was a massacre. The Turkish cavalry surrounded the Crusaders and cut them down systematically. Without armour, weapons, or training, the Crusaders had no chance. Thousands were killed in a few hours. Some Crusaders fled to an abandoned fortress and tried to make a stand. The Turks besieged it briefly, then captured it easily because the defenders had no food, no water, and no hope. Most were killed, though some were taken as slaves, particularly young men and women who could be sold in slave markets. This was standard practice in medieval warfare, though it doesn't make it any less horrific. A few managed to escape and make it back to Constantinople with news of the disaster. Peter the Hermit ironically survived because he wasn't with the main group when they were annihilated. He'd returned to Constantinople to try to get more supplies and support, which meant he was safely behind Byzantine walls when his followers were being destroyed. He would later join the main crusading armies and actually make it to Jerusalem, but his reputation as a leader was thoroughly destroyed. The People's Crusade was over, having accomplished nothing except demonstrating that religious enthusiasm without military capability is a recipe for disaster. The casualty figures are hard to determine precisely. Medieval chroniclers weren't great with numbers, but estimates range from 10,000 to 20,000 dead, out of perhaps 30,000 who had crossed into Anatolia. It was one of the most complete military disasters of the entire crusading period, and it happened before the actual organised crusade had even begun. The only positive outcome was that it provided a clear lesson in what not to do, which the subsequent noble-led armies would take to heart. The failure of the People's Crusade also illustrated the class dynamics of medieval society. The nobility viewed the disaster as proof that warfare should be left to professionals, meaning themselves, and that common people had no business trying to conduct military campaigns. The fact that the peasant crusaders had been driven by the same religious message that motivated noble crusaders was conveniently ignored. The narrative became, faithful peasants tried to serve God but lacked the military expertise necessary for success. Therefore, crusading should be an aristocratic endeavour. For the Turks, the destruction of the People's Crusade was satisfying but misleading. Kilij Arslan concluded that the Christians from the West were militarily incompetent and posed no serious threat. But it led him to underestimate the main crusading armies that would arrive the following year, which were a completely different proposition. The People's Crusade inadvertently set up the Turks for a strategic surprise when the real Crusader armies proved far more capable. While the People's Crusade was busy getting itself annihilated, the actual organised expeditions were preparing to depart. These were the armies led by major nobles, the Prince's Crusade as historians call it, and they were a different beast entirely. These were professional military forces with knights, cavalry, infantry, siege equipment, supply chains, and commanders who had actual military experience. They would prove far more effective than Peter's mob, though that was admittedly a low bar to clear. The main medieval European politics didn't allow for a single supreme commander. The nobles were too proud and too independent to accept unified command. So you had multiple armies that were supposed to coordinate but often ended up pursuing their own agendas. This was like trying to run a military campaign by committee, which is exactly as inefficient as it sounds. The first major contingent was led by Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, along with his brothers Eustace and Baldwin. Godfrey was in his late 30s, experienced in warfare, and had sold much of his land to finance the expedition. He was genuinely committed to the crusade rather than just seeking adventure. His force of around 10,000 men, including about 1,000 knights, departed in August 1096. They took the land route through Hungary, having learned from Peter's experience and obtained proper permission from the Hungarian king before marching through his territory. Godfrey's army reached Constantinople in December 1096, and their arrival created immediate diplomatic complications. Alexios wanted the Crusaders to swear oaths of loyalty to him, promising to return any conquered Byzantine territory to the empire. This made the Crusader nobles saw it differently. They'd travelled thousands of miles at great expense to fight Muslims, and they weren't interested in becoming Byzantine vassals or handing over their conquest to an emperor they didn't particularly trust or respect. The mutual suspicion between Western Crusaders and Byzantines, which would poison relations throughout the Crusade, was evident from the start. After several weeks of tense negotiation, Godfrey eventually swore the oath that Alexios wanted, though probably with mental reservations. The emperor provided supplies and transportation across the Bosporus, and Godfrey's army was ferried into Anatolia to wait for the other contingents. This pattern of arrival, negotiation, oath-taking and transport would repeat with each crusading army. The second major force was commanded by Bohemond of Taranto and his nephew Tancred. Bohemond was a Norman from southern Italy, son of Robert Guiscard, who had fought against Byzantium for years. He was ambitious, militarily skilled, and absolutely not to be trusted by anyone who valued their territory or possessions. Bohemond had fought the Byzantines before, knew Constantinople well, and saw the crusade at least partly as an opportunity for personal advancement. His army of perhaps 8,000 men took the sea route across the Adriatic and arrived at Constantinople in April 1097. Alexios must have been thrilled to see Bohemond, his old enemy, showing up with an army and claiming to be there to help. The negotiations were even more fraught than with Godfrey, but eventually Bohemond swore the oath, probably while planning how to break it the moment it became convenient. Bohemond was the kind of person who made Machiavelli look trusting, and his presence in the crusade would cause enormous diplomatic problems later. The third contingent was led by Raymond of Toulouse, Count of Saint-Gilles, who was probably the wealthiest and most powerful of the crusade leaders. Raymond was in his 50s, a veteran of wars in Spain against the Muslims, and took the crusade very seriously as a religious obligation. He brought the largest single force, perhaps 12,000 men, and his financial resources helped sustain other contingents. His army departed in October 1096 and took the land route, reaching Constantinople in April 1097. Raymond's negotiations with Alexios were complicated because Raymond actually took the religious aspects of the crusade seriously and didn't want to swear an oath that might compromise his service to God. He eventually swore a modified oath that satisfied neither party but allowed the diplomatic process to continue. Raymond would remain suspicious of Bohemond throughout the crusade, which was justified given Bohemond's character, but complicated military cooperation. The fourth major group was commanded by Robert of Normandy, Stephen of Blois, and Robert of Flanders, three nobles of roughly equal status who were travelling together. Their combined force of perhaps 10,000 men departed in October 1096, took the land route, and reached Constantinople in May 1097. By this point, Alexios had the negotiation process down to a routine: receive army, provide hospitality, negotiate oath, transport across Bosporus, and hope they didn't cause too many problems on the way out. There were other smaller contingents as well, bringing the total crusading force to somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people. of which perhaps 7,000 were mounted knights. These numbers are estimates. Medieval chroniclers exaggerated wildly in both directions, either inflating numbers for dramatic effect or understating them to make victories more impressive. Modern historians use various methods to estimate army sizes, but precision is impossible. What's clear is that this was a huge military force by medieval standards, probably the largest Christian army assembled in generations. By May 1097, all the major contingents had gathered in Byzantine territory in Anatolia near Nicaea. Alexios provided Byzantine troops to accompany them, along with military advisors who knew the region and the Turkish tactics. The Crusaders were now supposed to besiege Nicaea, the Seljuk capital in the region, which would be their first major test as a combined force. Nicaea was a formidable target. It was a substantial city, strongly fortified with walls that had been standing since Roman times. It sat on the edge of a large lake, which meant it couldn't be completely surrounded and could be resupplied by water. The Turkish garrison was well equipped and motivated to defend their capital. This wasn't going to be like conquering a small village. It was going to require siege warfare, which meant patience, logistics, and cooperation among the crusading armies. The siege began in May 1097. The Crusaders surrounded the city on the landward sides, cutting off the roads but unable to block the lake access. They built siege equipment, towers, ladders, and battering rams, while the defenders shot arrows and dropped stones on anyone who got close to the walls. Medieval siege warfare was not glamorous. It involved lots of digging, building, waiting, and occasionally getting shot or crushed by things falling from walls. The romantic image of siege warfare is considerably more romantic than the actual experience. The Crusaders' initial assaults on the walls were repulsed with heavy casualties. The defenders were experienced, the fortifications were solid, and the attackers were still learning to coordinate their efforts. Each noble commanded his own contingent, and getting them to attack simultaneously rather than sequentially required negotiation and planning. The Crusaders were slowly learning that cooperation was necessary, even if it was annoying. Meanwhile, Sultan Kilij Arslan was organising a relief force. He'd been away campaigning when the Crusaders arrived, and he rushed back when he heard his capital was under siege. He assembled an army, larger than what he'd used to destroy the People's Crusade, and marched to relieve Nicaea. The Crusaders, warned by Byzantine scouts, prepared to fight while maintaining the siege. This meant dividing their forces, which is strategically challenging, but they had enough men to manage it. On May 21, 1097, Kilij Arslan's army attacked the crusading camp. This was the first major battle between the organised Crusader armies and the Turkish forces, and it would determine whether the crusade continued or ended at Nicaea. The Turks used their standard tactics: mounted archers harassing the Crusader positions, feigned retreats to draw them out, rapid movement to exploit weaknesses. The Crusaders, learning from the fate of Peter's mob, maintained formation and refused to break ranks chasing Turkish cavalry. The battle lasted most of the day, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage. The Crusaders' heavy cavalry was devastating when it could get close enough to engage, but the Turkish horse archers kept their distance and shot arrows at the armoured knights, looking for gaps in protection. Medieval armour was effective but not perfect. Arrows could find joints, horse could be wounded, and even if the knight survived, being hit repeatedly by arrows was debilitating. Eventually, Raymond of Toulouse's contingent, which had just arrived and was fresh, attacked the Turkish flank and turned the battle. The Turks withdrew, not in panicked rout but in organised retreat. They'd failed to break the siege but hadn't been destroyed. Kilij Arslan concluded that his capital was lost and withdrew to defend his other territories, which was pragmatic but meant Nicaea's garrison was on their own. The siege continued into June, with the Crusaders gradually tightening their grip. The Byzantine fleet transported ships overland, yes, overland, dragging them on rollers, to the lake, cutting off Nicaea's water access. This was the kind of logistical feat that shows Byzantine engineering capability, and also the advantages of having professional military advisors who knew how to conduct sieges properly. In mid-June, the garrison negotiated surrender with the Byzantines rather than the Crusaders. Alexios's representatives offered terms that were more generous than what the Crusaders would have given. The garrison could leave alive, the city wouldn't be sacked, and everyone could go home. The garrison accepted, and Byzantine flags were raised over Nicaea before the Crusaders knew what was happening. The Crusader nobles were furious. The Byzantine decision to take control of the city and prevent looting seemed like betrayal, though from Alexios's perspective, he'd just recaptured a Byzantine city and didn't want it destroyed by Western barbarians. This incident deepened the mutual distrust between Crusaders and Byzantines and would have lasting consequences. However, Alexios provided generous gifts to the Crusader leaders as compensation, and more importantly, the crusade could now continue. The capture of Nicaea, even if they didn't get to loot it, was a major success. They'd proven they could besiege and capture a major fortified city. They'd defeated a Turkish field army, and they had a base of operations for advancing into Anatolia. The crusade was working, which was probably surprising to everyone involved, including the Crusaders themselves. On July 1st, 1097, just 2 weeks after Nicaea's surrender, the Crusaders faced their next major test at Dorylaeum. The army had divided into 2 main groups for the march through Anatolia, standard medieval practice to ease supply problems, with Bohemond commanding the advance guard and Raymond following a day behind with the main force. Kilij Arslan, looking to redeem his failure at Nicaea, ambushed Bohemond's contingent with his entire army. The Battle of Dorylaeum began badly for the Crusaders. The Turkish cavalry surrounded Bohemond's force and subjected them to constant arrow fire. The Crusaders formed a defensive position, using their tents and baggage as makeshift fortifications, and sent messengers to Raymond's contingent asking for immediate help. This was exactly the kind of mobile warfare that had destroyed the People's Crusade, and for several hours it looked like the advance guard would be annihilated. But Bohemond's troops, unlike Peter's peasants, were professional soldiers who maintained discipline under pressure. The heavily armoured knights formed a shield wall that arrows couldn't penetrate easily. The infantry protected the baggage and non-combatants. They held their position and waited for relief, which was the correct tactical decision even if it was terrifying for everyone involved. Medieval battles were often decided by which side broke first, and the Crusaders refused to break. Raymond's contingent arrived by afternoon, having made a forced march when they heard the fighting. They attacked the Turkish forces from behind, catching them between 2 crusading armies. The Turks, who had thought they were ambushing an isolated force, suddenly found themselves in a 2-front battle against numerically superior enemies. The Crusader heavy cavalry charged, and the Turkish forces not prepared for this reversal broke and fled. The victory at Dorylaeum was decisive. The Crusaders pursued the fleeing Turks, captured their camp with all its supplies and treasure, and inflicted heavy casualties. More importantly, Kilij Arslan concluded that he couldn't defeat the Crusaders in open battle, and withdrew from Anatolia entirely, ceding the territory to the Christians. The road to the south and east was open, and the crusade could continue. The march across Anatolia that followed was perhaps more difficult than the battles. The Crusaders were moving through territory that had been devastated by decades of Turkish raids and Byzantine-Turkish warfare. The Turks practiced scorched earth tactics, destroying crops and poisoning wells as they withdrew, which meant the Crusaders were marching through a wasteland. Water was scarce, food was limited, and the summer heat of Anatolia was brutal for European soldiers wearing armour and heavy clothing designed for temperate climates. Many Crusaders died during this march, not from combat but from heat exhaustion, dehydration, disease, and sheer physical exhaustion. Horses died in large numbers, forcing knights to walk or ride on oxen and donkeys, which was humiliating for proud nobles but necessary for survival. The army that emerged from Anatolia was smaller and more hardened than the one that entered, and the survivors had learned valuable lessons about logistics and the importance of water supply. During the march, Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's brother, split off from the main army with a small force to pursue his own agenda. Baldwin had concluded that serving in the main crusade army wasn't going to make him rich or powerful, and he decided to carve out his own territory. He marched northeast toward Armenia, which was Christian but politically fragmented, looking for opportunities. Baldwin ended up in Edessa, a city in northern Mesopotamia, where the local Armenian ruler Thoros was desperately seeking military help against Turkish pressure. Thoros adopted Baldwin as his son and heir, which was a common medieval practice for securing alliances. Then, conveniently for Baldwin, Thoros was murdered in a riot that Baldwin definitely had nothing to do with and couldn't possibly have orchestrated. Baldwin became Count of Edessa, establishing the First Crusade state and demonstrating that the crusade wasn't just about Jerusalem, but also about territorial conquest. The main crusading army continued south, reaching the Syrian city of Antioch in October 1097. Antioch would be the next major objective, and the siege would last 8 months, becoming one of the most dramatic episodes of the entire crusade. But we'll get to that in the next chapter. For now, the Crusaders had proven they could organise, coordinate, defeat Turkish armies in battle, conduct successful sieges, and survive long marches through hostile territory. The Prince's Crusade was succeeding where the People's Crusade had failed catastrophically, and Jerusalem was getting closer, though the journey was far from over. The crusading army arrived at Antioch in October 1097, and if you're imagining they took one look at the city, decided it was too hard and moved on to easier targets, you don't understand medieval siege warfare. Antioch was strategically crucial. It controlled the route to Jerusalem, had substantial resources, and was one of the great cities of the ancient world. It also happened to be extremely well fortified, heavily garrisoned, and basically impossible to capture quickly. The Crusaders decided to besiege it anyway, because at this point they'd come too far to turn back, and apparently nobody had explained to them that sieges of major cities typically ended badly for the besiegers. Antioch was extraordinary by any measure. The city had been one of the most important in the Roman and Byzantine empires, a commercial hub and military stronghold. Its walls stretched for roughly 3 miles, climbing up the mountainside to a citadel perched on a peak that overlooked everything. These weren't medieval walls hastily thrown up. These were Roman fortifications built with engineering expertise that made them nearly impregnable. The walls had over 400 towers, which meant that anyone trying to approach them would be shot at from multiple angles simultaneously. The defensive position was so strong that the city had been besieged many times in its history and rarely captured by assault. The garrison was commanded by Yaghi, a Turkish emir who had ruled Antioch since 1085. He'd had 12 years to prepare the defences, stock supplies and train troops. When he saw the crusading army approaching, and you could see an army that size from a long distance, they weren't subtle. He made all the right defensive preparations. He expelled the city's Christian population, who might be sympathetic to the Crusaders, which was brutal but strategically sound. He sent messages to other Muslim rulers requesting help. He ensured the garrison was well supplied and motivated. Yaghi was doing everything right from a defensive standpoint. The Crusaders, arriving in October, had about 40,000 people, though not all of them were soldiers. Medieval armies travelled with massive baggage trains including servants, cooks, priests, merchants, and various hangers-on who weren't combatants but still needed to eat. The actual fighting force was perhaps 20,000 to 25,000, still substantial but not nearly enough to fully surround a city of Antioch's size. The Crusaders could blockade some gates, but not all of them, which meant supplies could still reach the city. The Crusader leadership quickly realised they had a problem. They couldn't take the city by assault. The walls were too strong and the garrison too large. They couldn't fully surround it. They didn't have enough men. And they couldn't just bypass it. Leaving a hostile city with a large garrison in their rear was strategically insane. So they settled into a siege, which meant camping outside the walls and waiting for the defenders to run out of food before the attackers did. This was going to be a race to see who starved first, which is not the kind of competition anyone wants to win. The Crusaders could forage in the surrounding countryside for food. The weather was tolerable. Northern Syria in fall and early winter is mild compared to European winters. Morale was relatively high after the victories at Nicaea and Dorylaeum. The army constructed fortifications around their camps and settled into what they hoped would be a short siege. Spoiler alert, it was not a short siege. The first major crisis came in December, when a Turkish relief force from Damascus approached Antioch. The Crusaders had to detach troops from the siege to meet this threat, which meant weakening the blockade and allowing supplies to reach the city. The resulting battle was a Crusader victory. They'd learned how to fight Turkish cavalry by now, but it was exhausting and costly, and it demonstrated a fundamental problem. As long as Muslim rulers could send relief armies, the siege couldn't succeed. Winter arrived, and with it came the real suffering. Northern Syria gets cold and wet in winter, not European snow and ice cold, but cold enough when you're living in tents and trying to maintain a siege. Rain turned the Crusader camps into mud pits. Disease began spreading through the army. Dysentery, typhus, and various other medieval afflictions that thrive in crowded, unsanitary conditions started killing people faster than Turkish arrows did. Medieval military camps were not known for their hygiene, and a long-term siege created conditions where disease flourished. Food became increasingly scarce. The surrounding countryside had been stripped of supplies, and the Crusaders had no established supply line bringing food from friendly territory. They were living off whatever they could forage, purchase from local populations, or receive from the occasional supply ship that reached the port of St. Simeon. Prices skyrocketed as basic economics kicked in. When you have high demand and low supply, costs increase. A chicken that might have cost a few pennies now cost more than a soldier earned in a month. Horse meat became a delicacy. People were eating animals and plants that would normally be considered inedible. The chroniclers describe nobles eating grass and roots. Knights who had owned multiple horses were reduced to fighting on foot because their mounts had died of starvation or been eaten. The contrast between the Crusaders' initial confidence and their current misery was stark. These were men who had left Europe as wealthy nobles, professional warriors, bearers of Christendom's military might. Now they were starving in the mud outside a city they couldn't capture, eating things they wouldn't normally feed to their dogs, and wondering if this crusade had been a terrible mistake. Desertion became a serious problem. When you're cold, wet, hungry, diseased, and don't see any chance of victory, the appeal of just going home becomes overwhelming. Soldiers and even some knights began slipping away at night, heading back toward Constantinople or the coast, abandoning the crusade. The nobility tried to prevent this by posting guards and threatening punishment. But you can't really guard an army of tens of thousands when everyone is demoralized and desperate. The most famous desertion was by Peter the Hermit. Yes, the same Peter whose mob had been destroyed at Civito. He'd joined the main crusading army and had been serving as a sort of chaplain and spiritual advisor. In January 1098, Peter tried to desert along with William the Carpenter, another knight who'd had enough. They were caught, brought back, and forced to continue with the army. This was humiliating for Peter, whose reputation as a spiritual leader was thoroughly demolished, but it also showed how desperate the situation had become that even the Crusade's most famous preacher wanted to leave. Stephen of Blois, one of the major Crusade leaders and one of the wealthiest men in France, deserted in June 1098, just before the final crisis. He claimed he was going to get more supplies and reinforcements, but everyone knew he was abandoning the crusade. His wife, Adela of Normandy, was apparently not impressed. She was William the Conqueror's daughter and had very high standards for masculine courage. She essentially shamed Stephen into going back on crusade later, which says something about medieval gender dynamics and the power of aristocratic women to influence their husbands through social pressure. The Crusader leadership was fragmenting under the stress. Bohemond, the rivalry between these two commanders would plague the crusade throughout, and at Antioch it was becoming actively harmful to military effectiveness. Other nobles had their own disputes and ambitions. The unified command that had never really existed was breaking down entirely. The Byzantine representative with the army, Tatikios, left in February 1098. He claimed he was going to get supplies and Byzantine reinforcements, but the Crusaders suspected he was abandoning them because he knew the siege was going to fail. The chroniclers, particularly those who didn't like the Byzantines, which was most of them, portrayed this as treachery and cowardice. In reality, Tatikios probably recognized that the Crusaders were in an impossible situation and didn't want to die with them. This departure further damaged Byzantine-Crusader relations and would have consequences later. Meanwhile, inside Antioch, the garrison was also suffering. The Crusader blockade, while incomplete, was effective enough to limit supplies reaching the city. Food prices were rising inside the walls as well. The garrison was large, which meant many mouths to feed, and while they had better shelter than the Crusaders outside, they were still enduring a siege. Yaghi-Sian was waiting for relief forces to arrive and break the siege, but months were passing and no help was coming. In the spring of 1098, the situation became critical for both sides. The Crusaders were starving and desperate. The garrison was under pressure and receiving no support. Something had to break, and it was going to be either the Crusaders giving up and leaving or the city being captured. This is Bohemond had been secretly negotiating with a tower commander inside Antioch named Firuz. Now, Firuz's motivations are unclear from the sources. Some say he was Christian and sympathetic to the Crusaders. Some say he was bribed. Some say he had personal grievances against Yaghi-Sian. What's clear is that Firuz agreed to betray the city by allowing Crusaders into his tower, which would open the way for the army to enter Antioch. This betrayal was exactly the kind of opportunity Bohemond specialized in. He was not a straightforward military commander who believed in honor and direct assault. He was a schemer who understood that sieges were often won through treachery rather than force. He negotiated with Firuz, made promises about money and protection, and arranged the details of the betrayal with the kind of attention to detail you'd expect from someone planning a heist. Bohemond then went to the other Crusader leaders and said essentially, "I can get us into the city, but if I do, I want Antioch for myself." The other nobles were in no position to refuse. They were desperate, they knew the siege was failing, and Bohemond was offering them victory if they'd agree to his terms. Raymond of Toulouse objected. He didn't trust Bohemond and didn't want him to have such a powerful city. But the other leaders overruled him. Desperation makes people agree to deals they'd otherwise reject. On the night of June 23, 1098, the plan went into action. Bohemond led a select group of soldiers to Firouz's tower. They climbed rope ladders, which must have been nerve-wracking in the dark, climbing up stone walls hoping the rope holds and nobody notices you, and entered the tower. Firouz allowed them in. They killed the garrison in the tower, and then opened the way for more crusaders to enter. It was the medieval equivalent of a covert operation, except with more armour and less night vision equipment. Once inside the tower, the crusaders spread through that section of wall and opened a nearby gate. The main crusading army, which had been waiting nearby, poured into the city. The garrison, caught completely by surprise in the middle of the night, couldn't organise an effective defence. The fighting became chaotic urban warfare, with crusaders spreading through the streets, breaking into houses and killing anyone they found. Medieval urban combat was brutal and confused, with no clear front lines and constant danger from every direction. Yagi Sion, realising the city was lost, fled with his bodyguard. He didn't make it far. He was captured by Armenian peasants in the countryside and killed. His head was brought back to Antioch, which was the kind of trophy that medieval warriors appreciated in a way that modern sensibilities find disturbing. The city's garrison mostly died fighting or surrendered and was killed anyway. The Muslim civilian population was massacred or enslaved. This was standard practice in medieval siege warfare. Cities that resisted were punished severely to discourage future resistance, but it was still a horrific bloodbath. By June 3rd, 1098, the Crusaders controlled Antioch. They'd done what seemed impossible, capturing one of the strongest fortresses in the Middle East through a combination of persistence, desperation, and well-timed betrayal. They celebrated, looted the city, ate the food stores they found, and generally enjoyed their first real victory in months. It must have felt like the worst was behind them, and Jerusalem was now within reach. Then they got news that absolutely ruined the celebration. A massive Muslim relief army was approaching, led by Kerboha, the Atabeg of Mosul. This army had been assembled specifically to relieve Antioch and destroy the Crusaders, and it was reportedly huge. Sources give numbers ranging from 75,000 to 300,000, which were exaggerations, but even a conservative estimate put it at larger than the entire crusading force. And the Crusaders, who had just captured Antioch through months of starvation and suffering, were now trapped inside the city they'd just conquered. The irony was savage. The Crusaders had spent 8 months besieging Antioch, slowly starving. Now they were inside Antioch, and they were about to be besieged themselves. The food stores they'd captured weren't enough to sustain the army for long. They were exhausted from the siege and the night assault. Many were, and now Kerboga's army arrived on June 5th, just 2 days after the Crusaders had captured the city. The Muslims immediately surrounded Antioch and began a siege, except unlike the Crusaders' siege, they had enough men to actually surround the entire city. The citadel on the mountain, which the Crusaders hadn't captured, was still held by Muslim troops who could coordinate with Kerboga's forces. The Crusaders were completely trapped with no possibility of escape or resupply. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Whatever food the Crusaders had found in the city was being consumed by thousands of people. Water was available from the Orontes River, which ran through the city, but food was scarce. Within days they were back to starving, which must have been psychologically devastating after briefly having enough to eat. Horses that had survived the march and the siege were slaughtered and eaten. People were eating leather, grass, anything remotely edible. Morale collapsed. Many crusaders became convinced they were going to die in Antioch. Some tried to escape by climbing down the walls at night and deserting, though most who tried were caught by Muslim patrols and killed. Others fell into despair, believing this was divine punishment for their sins. The spiritual crisis was as bad as the physical suffering. They'd come on crusade believing God would protect them, and now they were trapped and starving after finally achieving victory. This is where Peter Bartholomew enters the story, and things get weird. Peter was a peasant who had visions, or claimed to have visions, depending on your skepticism level, about the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion. According to Peter, St. Andrew had appeared to him multiple times, telling him the lance was buried in Antioch's Cathedral of St. Peter, and that finding it would bring victory. The crusade leadership was sceptical, particularly Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate, who knew that another church already claimed to possess the Holy Lance and suspected Peter was a fraud. But Raymond of Toulouse, desperate for anything that might restore morale, supported Peter. They dug in the cathedral floor where Peter indicated, and after hours of digging with Peter himself in the hole directing the search, someone found a piece of metal that could plausibly be an ancient spearhead. Whether this was the genuine article, a random piece of metal, or something Peter had planted is debated by historians. What mattered was that the Crusaders believed it was the Holy Lance. The discovery restored morale almost instantly. Soldiers who had been despairing now believed God had shown them a sign. The spiritual crisis was resolved, at least temporarily, by what was either a miracle or an elaborate hoax. And honestly, the historical evidence doesn't let us conclude definitively either way. The Crusader leadership, seeing morale restored, decided to attempt something desperate. They would sortie out of Antioch and fight Kerboga's army in the field. This was strategically insane. They were outnumbered, weakened by starvation, and Kerboga's forces were well fed and fresh. But staying in Antioch meant slow death by starvation, and at least fighting gave them a chance. It's the kind of decision you make when all your options are terrible, and you choose the one that at least lets you die fighting rather than starving. First, Bohemond sent envoys to negotiate with Kerboga, offering to surrender Antioch in exchange for safe passage to leave. This was probably a genuine offer. Bohemond wasn't sentimental about the city, and survival was more important than pride. Kerboga refused, demanding unconditional surrender. This was a mistake on Kerboga's part. If he'd accepted, the crusade would have ended at Antioch. Instead, he gave the Crusaders no choice but to fight. On June 28, 1098, the crusading army marched out of Antioch to face Kerboga. They organised into contingents under their various leaders, with Bohemond commanding the overall strategy. They carried the Holy Lance as a battle standard, which was either inspiring or desperate symbolism depending on your perspective. The army was smaller than it had been months earlier. Many had died, deserted, or were too sick to fight. But everyone who could walk was in the ranks because this was the last throw of the dice. Kerboga's army significantly outnumbered the Crusaders, but they made critical tactical errors. First, they didn't attack immediately as the Crusaders were deploying, which gave the Christians time to organise. Second, Kerboga's coalition was politically fragmented. The various emirs and commanders had competing interests and didn't coordinate well. Third, and most importantly, they underestimated the desperation of cornered enemies. The Crusaders were fighting for survival, which gives soldiers extraordinary motivation. The battle began with the Muslim forces attacking the Crusader formations. The Crusaders, remembering the lessons from Dorylaeum, maintained tight formations and didn't break ranks despite the arrow fire. Their heavily armoured cavalry, when it charged, broke through the Muslim lines. The desperation that should have been a weakness became a strength. Men with nothing to lose fight with reckless courage. The exact details of the battle are unclear because the chroniclers disagree and medieval battle narratives are often confusing. What's clear is that Kerboga's coalition began to fracture. Some contingents, seeing the fierce resistance, withdrew from the battle. Others were defeated piecemeal as the Crusaders' charges broke their formations. Kerboga himself reportedly left the field relatively early, and once the commander withdrew, the coalition army disintegrated. The Muslim forces retreated and the retreat became a rout. The Crusaders pursued, killing fleeing soldiers and capturing the abandoned camp with all its supplies. The victory was so complete that it seemed miraculous to the participants. They'd been starving and desperate, outnumbered and trapped, and they'd not only survived but won decisively. The chroniclers attributed this to divine intervention, and honestly, from the Crusaders' perspective, that was the most logical explanation available. The capture of Antioch and the defeat of Kerboga's relief force were the turning points of the First Crusade. The Crusaders had survived their greatest crisis and proven they could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The Muslim world, which had been slow to unite against the Crusade, was shocked by the defeat of such a large army. The road to Jerusalem was now open, though it would still take another year and more suffering to get there. But the victory came at an enormous cost. Thousands of Crusaders had died during the siege and the fighting. The army was depleted and exhausted. Relations between the Crusader leaders were worse than ever. Bohemond claimed Antioch as his own, Raymond disputed this claim, and the other nobles had various grievances and ambitions. The Byzantine alliance was effectively dead. Alexios hadn't sent help during the crisis, and the Crusaders felt abandoned. The army remained in Antioch for months, recovering from the siege, fighting over control of the city and trying to decide what to do next. Some wanted to consolidate control over Syria before moving on Jerusalem. Others, particularly the common soldiers and pilgrims, demanded they continue to Jerusalem immediately. They'd come on crusade to liberate the Holy City, not to establish petty kingdoms in Syria. Eventually, pressure from the rank and file forced the leaders to continue toward Jerusalem. In January 1099, Raymond of Toulouse led a contingent south, and the other leaders grudgingly followed. Bohemond stayed in Antioch. He'd gotten what he wanted, a powerful city that he could rule as his own principality. The crusade would continue, but it was a smaller, more fractious, more exhausted force than had assembled at Nicaea 2 years earlier. The siege of Antioch had tested everything about the Crusaders: their military capability, their faith, their endurance, their willingness to suffer for their goal. They'd passed the test, barely, through a combination of military skill, desperate courage, timely betrayal, possibly divine intervention, and definitely extraordinary luck. Jerusalem was still ahead, but after Antioch nothing else would seem quite as impossible. After months of political infighting in Antioch, with the Crusader leaders arguing about who should control what territory and whether they should even continue toward Jerusalem, the common soldiers and pilgrims essentially forced the issue. They hadn't travelled thousands of miles and endured years of suffering to watch nobles squabble over Syrian cities. They wanted Jerusalem, and they made it very clear that they were going with or without their aristocratic commanders. This was one of those rare moments in medieval history where the lower classes actually influenced high-level strategic decisions, usually by threatening to riot or simply leave. In January 1099, Raymond of Toulouse finally began the march south toward Jerusalem. He went barefoot as a gesture of humility and penance, which must have been deeply uncomfortable given the terrain and the fact that shoes exist for a reason. But medieval religious devotion often involved deliberately making yourself miserable to prove your faith. The other contingents followed. Though Bohemond stayed in Antioch, he'd achieved his goal of acquiring a principality and wasn't particularly interested in the pilgrimage aspect of the crusade. Baldwin was still in Edessa running his county. The army that marched on Jerusalem was smaller than the force that had besieged Antioch, perhaps 12,000 to 15,000 total, of which only about 300 were knights. This was still substantial, but it was a fraction of the force that had left Europe. The march down the coast was complicated by the political situation in the region. The Crusaders were moving through territory that was contested between various Muslim powers, and their approach created diplomatic opportunities and challenges. Cities and towns had to decide whether to resist, negotiate, or surrender. Some chose to pay tribute to the Crusaders to avoid being besieged. Others prepared their defences. The Crusaders' reputation for taking cities by force and massacring populations preceded them, which was useful for intimidation, but also ensured that cities that did choose to resist fought desperately. One of the more interesting diplomatic encounters occurred with the Fatimid Caliphate, which controlled Egypt and had recently reconquered Jerusalem from the Seljuk Turks in August 1098. The Fatimids were Shia Muslims while the Seljuks were Sunni, and the two powers were rivals. From the Fatimid perspective, the Crusaders were useful idiots who had weakened the Seljuks at Antioch and elsewhere. The Fatimids sent envoys to the Crusaders with a proposal. The Crusaders could visit Jerusalem as pilgrims in small groups, and the Fatimids would protect them and allow them access to the holy sites. Everyone wins, no need for war. This was actually a reasonable proposal. It would have given the Crusaders what they'd ostensibly come for, access to Jerusalem for pilgrimage, without further fighting. But the Crusaders rejected it, and understanding why tells us a lot about what the Crusade had become. First, the Crusaders no longer trusted any Muslim power after years of warfare. Second, they'd invested too much in lives, treasure, and suffering to accept anything less than complete control of Jerusalem. Third, many Crusaders had concluded that Muslims were fundamentally untrustworthy and that any agreement would be violated. And fourth, by this point, the Crusade was as much about conquest and establishing Christian political control as it was about pilgrimage. The rejection of the Fatimid proposal meant that when the Crusaders reached Jerusalem, they would be fighting the Fatimid garrison, not the weakened Seljuk forces. This was unfortunate for the Crusaders because the Fatimids had just reinforced Jerusalem with fresh troops and supplies. If they'd arrived a year earlier when the Seljuks held it, the city might have been less well defended. Timing, as always, mattered in warfare. The march continued through the spring of 1099, with the Crusaders moving down the coast of the Levant. They besieged and captured several smaller cities and fortresses, though these sieges were shorter than Antioch because the garrisons were smaller, and the Crusaders had learned from experience. At Acre, they spent several weeks in a siege that went nowhere and accomplished nothing except wasting time and resources. Raymond of Toulouse wanted to capture it to add to his own territorial holdings, but the other leaders eventually convinced him to give up and continue to Jerusalem. The political tensions between Crusader leaders remained high throughout the march. They reached Jerusalem on June 7, 1099, nearly 3 years after departing Europe. For the Crusaders, this was the culmination of their pilgrimage, the goal they'd been fighting toward through all the suffering and setbacks. Many Crusaders wept when they first saw the city, and according to the chroniclers, they prayed and gave thanks to God for allowing them to reach the holy city. The emotional impact of arriving at Jerusalem after everything they'd endured cannot be overstated. This was the moment that gave meaning to all their suffering. Jerusalem in 1099 was a substantial city, though smaller than Antioch. The population was diverse. Muslims, Jews, and Eastern Christians all lived in the city under Fatimid rule. The fortifications were strong, with walls that dated to various periods of reconstruction and reinforcement. The garrison was relatively small, perhaps 1,000 soldiers plus militia, but they were well supplied and motivated. The Fatimid governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, had prepared the city for siege by expelling the Christian population, who might be sympathetic to the Crusaders, and stockpiling supplies. He'd also poisoned or blocked wells outside the city to deny water to besiegers. The Crusaders' first problem was water. It was early June, and the Palestinian summer was beginning. Jerusalem sits on a plateau with limited water sources. The Crusaders couldn't access the city's wells and cisterns, and the nearby springs were either poisoned or under the defenders' control. Water had to be carried from several miles away, which was exhausting work in the heat. Dehydration became a serious problem almost immediately. Medieval armies needed enormous amounts of water, not just for drinking, but for horses, cooking, and basic hygiene. The lack of water was going to make this siege much harder than it might otherwise have been. The second problem was timber. To take a fortified city by assault, you need siege equipment, towers, ladders, battering rams. These require timber, and the area around Jerusalem had been stripped of trees by centuries of construction and fuel gathering. The Crusaders had to send expeditions miles away to find suitable timber and then transport it back to Jerusalem, which was slow and exhausting. They needed skilled carpenters to build the siege equipment, and while they had some craftsmen in the army, building siege towers is specialized work that not everyone can do. The third problem was time. The Crusaders knew that Egypt would send a relief army to lift the siege. They needed to capture Jerusalem before that army arrived, or they'd be caught between the city garrison and the relief force, which was exactly the situation they'd barely survived at Antioch. The pressure to move fast was enormous, but sieges naturally favour defenders and take time. The Crusaders were stuck in a race against the calendar, trying to build siege equipment and assault the walls before the Fatimid army showed up. The garrison inside Jerusalem was confident they could hold out. The walls were strong, the supplies were adequate, and relief was coming. They conducted an aggressive defence, making sorties to harass the Crusaders, shooting at anyone who came within range, and generally making the siege as difficult as possible. Iftikhar ad-Dawla was an experienced commander who understood siege warfare, and he wasn't going to make the mistakes that had led to Antioch's fall. The Crusaders attempted to assault the walls in mid-June without siege equipment, using ladders they'd hastily constructed. This went about as well as you'd expect, badly. Trying to climb walls while defenders drop stones and shoot arrows at you is dangerous under the best circumstances, and the Crusaders didn't have the best circumstances. The assault failed with significant casualties, proving that they couldn't take Jerusalem without proper siege equipment. They were going to have to do this the hard way. The Crusaders had found timber and had carpenters who knew their craft. They built two main siege towers, massive wooden structures several stories tall that could be rolled up to the walls and allow soldiers to attack from the same height as the defenders. Building these towers was an engineering challenge. They had to be strong enough to support armed men, tall enough to match the walls, and mobile despite weighing tons. Medieval siege engineering was genuinely impressive when it worked, though when it didn't work, the towers could collapse, burn, or simply get stuck. The Genoese ships that had arrived at Jaffa, a port city the Crusaders had captured, provided crucial supplies including rope, nails, and skilled sailors who knew engineering. The Genoese assistance was vital. They brought expertise and materials that the Crusaders desperately needed. In exchange, the Genoese secured trading privileges in whatever territories the Crusaders conquered, which was good business planning on their part. Medieval commerce and military conquest often went hand in hand. While the siege towers were being built, the Crusaders faced the daily misery of a summer siege in Palestine. The heat was brutal. Temperatures in Jerusalem in June and July can exceed 85 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and the Crusaders were wearing armour, heavy clothing, and living in tents with no air conditioning. Heat exhaustion was common. The water shortage made everything worse. Dehydrated people can't work effectively, can't fight effectively, and are much more vulnerable to disease. Morale fluctuated wildly during the siege. Sometimes the Crusaders were confident they'd succeed. Other times, particularly when the heat and thirst were worst, they despaired. Religious processions and services were organised to maintain morale and spiritual commitment. In early July, a priest named Peter Desiderius claimed to have received a vision instructing the Crusaders to fast, pray, and march around the city walls barefoot, following the biblical precedent of Joshua at Jericho. This seemed like a terrible idea from a practical standpoint. Fasting and walking barefoot in the summer heat when you're already dehydrated. But medieval military thinking included a lot of faith that God would provide. On July 8, 1099, the Crusaders performed this religious procession. They marched around the walls of Jerusalem barefoot, carrying crosses and relics, singing hymns and praying. The garrison on the walls watched this spectacle and apparently found it bizarre and amusing. The chroniclers report that the defenders mocked the Crusaders and made obscene gestures, which didn't improve interfaith relations. From the Crusaders' perspective, this was a sacred act of devotion. From the defenders' perspective, it was their enemies voluntarily exhausting themselves in the heat, which was strategically helpful. After the procession, the Crusaders held a council where they worked out their final assault plan. Raymond of Toulouse would attack the southern wall with his siege tower. Godfrey of Bouillon would attack the northern wall with the other siege tower. Other contingents would assault different sections of wall with ladders and whatever siege equipment they could improvise. The idea was to force the garrison to divide its forces defending multiple points, preventing them from concentrating their defence. The siege towers were completed by mid-July. These were impressive structures, perhaps 40 feet tall, built in sections that could be assembled, covered with wet animal hides to protect against fire, equipped with drawbridges that could be dropped onto the walls. Moving them into position was an enormous task, requiring hundreds of men pushing and pulling while defenders shot at them from the walls. The Crusaders filled the defensive ditches with stones and rubble to create a path for the towers, working under constant arrow fire. On the night of July 13-14, Godfrey's tower was moved into position against the northern wall. This was done at night to minimise casualties and to achieve surprise. The tower was positioned, preparations were made, and the final assault was scheduled for the morning of July 15th. The Crusaders knew this was their last chance. If the assault failed, the relief army would arrive, and they'd have to abandon the siege. Everything depended on the next day. July 15th, 1099, began with the Crusaders making their final preparations. Knights donned their armour, weapons were sharpened, prayers were said, and everyone understood that today would determine the outcome of the entire crusade. The siege towers were positioned against the walls, ladders were prepared, and the assault began. The fighting was intense and chaotic. The defenders concentrated their forces against Godfrey's tower on the northern wall, recognising it as the main threat. They threw down stones, shot arrows, and tried to set the tower on fire with incendiary projectiles. The medieval siege assault was close quarters, brutal fighting where small advantages could be decisive. At one point, the defenders nearly succeeded in burning Godfrey's tower. They threw containers of flaming materials at it, and parts of the tower caught fire despite the wet hide protection. The Crusaders frantically extinguished the flames while under fire, which required remarkable courage and discipline. If the tower had burned completely, the assault would have failed. But they managed to save it and continued pushing forward. By midday, Godfrey's tower reached the wall, and the drawbridge was dropped onto the battlements. This created a bridge between the tower and the wall that Crusaders could cross to attack the defenders directly. The first soldiers across were taking their lives in their hands. Stepping onto that bridge meant exposing yourself to defenders' weapons with limited ability to defend yourself. It required either extraordinary courage or sufficient desperation that caution was abandoned. The exact identity of the first crusader onto the walls is debated by chronicles. Different accounts credit different knights. What matters is that someone made it across, survived long enough to hold a position, and others followed. Once crusaders established a foothold on the walls, they could bring more soldiers across, and the defensive position began to collapse. The garrison fell back, trying to establish new defensive positions in the streets, but once the walls were breached, the city's fall was inevitable. Crusaders poured through the breach, opening gates from inside to let more troops in. Raymond's southern attack was still being held at this point, but once the northern wall was breached, it didn't matter. The garrison retreated toward the citadel, trying to organise a last stand, but the Crusaders were inside the city in force, and resistance was collapsing. What followed was massacre. The Crusaders killed everyone they encountered in the city: Muslim civilians, Jewish residents who had taken refuge in the synagogue, Eastern Christians who were caught in the chaos. The killing lasted for days, and while exact casualty figures are impossible to determine, The chronicles describe blood running in the streets and bodies piled in enormous heaps. This was not unusual for medieval siege warfare. Cities that resisted were punished severely to discourage future resistance. But the scale and religious nature of the violence made it particularly horrific. The Jewish community, who had taken shelter in the main synagogue, was burned alive when crusaders set the building on fire. The massacre of Jews in Jerusalem paralleled the earlier Rhineland pogroms and demonstrated how religious warfare could easily target any non-Christians. The Crusaders viewed themselves as purifying the holy city, removing all non-Christian presence, which from their theological perspective was righteous, but from any moral perspective was atrocity. Muslim defenders who reached the citadel surrendered to Raymond of Toulouse, who granted them safe passage to leave the city. This was controversial. Other Crusader leaders wanted them killed, but Raymond kept his word and they were allowed to depart. This small act of mercy was notable precisely because it was exceptional in the context of Jerusalem's capture. The Crusaders proceeded to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site of Christ's tomb, and held a service of thanksgiving. After 3 years of crusading, they had reached their goal. Jerusalem was Christian again, for the first time since the 7th century Arab conquest over 400 years earlier. From the Crusaders' perspective, this was the fulfillment of God's will, the vindication of their suffering, and proof that their crusade had been divinely ordained. The massacre that accompanied the capture of Jerusalem has been debated by historians ever since. Some point out that medieval warfare was brutal by modern standards, and that massacres after sieges were not unusual. Others note that the religious motivation and scale of killing at Jerusalem exceeded typical medieval violence. The Muslim and Jewish sources describe it as an unmitigated atrocity. The Christian chronicles present it as righteous vengeance against God's enemies. Modern historians generally acknowledge it as a war crime by contemporary standards, while noting the medieval context. The political aftermath of Jerusalem's capture was complicated. Who would rule the holy city? Raymond of Toulouse refused to be crowned king, saying he wouldn't wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns, which was either genuine piety or savvy political positioning. Godfrey, whether this was humility or just semantic difference, is debatable. He ruled the city with royal authority even if he didn't use the royal title. The Crusaders had to quickly organize the defense of Jerusalem and the surrounding territory. The Fatimid relief army was still coming, and they needed to prepare for battle while also establishing governance of the newly captured city. Most of the army consisted of pilgrims who wanted to complete their pilgrimage obligations and return home. They'd fulfilled their crusading vow by reaching Jerusalem, and many departed soon after. The force that remained to defend the Crusader conquest was much smaller than the army that had captured the city. In August 1099, the Fatimid army arrived at Ascalon, a coastal city south of Jerusalem. Godfrey marched out with whatever forces he could muster, perhaps 10,000 men, including many who had been preparing to leave but were convinced to stay for one more battle. The Battle of Ascalon on August 12, 1099 was another Crusader victory, with the Fatimid army being defeated and scattered. This victory secured the Crusader hold on Jerusalem and demonstrated that the Crusader states could defend themselves against counterattacks. The capture of Jerusalem and victory at Ascalon effectively ended the First Crusade. The immediate military objectives had been achieved. Jerusalem was in Christian hands, major Muslim counterattacks had been defeated, and Crusader states were being established in the Levant. Many Crusaders returned home to Europe, having fulfilled their vows and survived the ordeal. Some stayed to settle in the newly conquered territories, becoming the ruling class of the Crusader kingdoms. The crusade had succeeded beyond what most participants had thought possible. They'd travelled thousands of miles through hostile territory, captured major cities, defeated larger armies, and established Christian states in the Middle East. The cost had been enormous, tens of thousands dead from battle, disease, starvation, and exhaustion. The violence had been extraordinary, with massacres that would be remembered for centuries. The political consequences would reshape the medieval world and create conflicts that persisted for generations. But in July 1099, standing in Jerusalem after 3 years of crusading, the survivors believed it had all been worth it. They'd achieved something that had seemed impossible, liberated the holy city, and fulfilled what they believed was God's will. The fact that they'd done it through conquest, massacre, and violence that violated every principle of the religion they claimed to serve was reconciled through the medieval belief that warfare against non-Christians was righteous and that the ends justified the means. The First Crusade was over, but its consequences were just beginning. The Crusader states would survive for decades and in some cases centuries, requiring constant reinforcement from Europe and generating ongoing conflict with Muslim neighbours. The crusading movement would continue with multiple subsequent crusades, none of which would achieve the success of the first. The relations between Christianity and Islam, already strained, would be poisoned for generations, and the medieval world would be reshaped by what had started with Pope Urban II's speech at Clermont and ended with crusaders standing in Jerusalem, covered in blood and convinced they'd done God's work. The night of July 14th to 15, 1099 was tense in both the crusader camp and inside Jerusalem's walls. Everyone knew the decisive assault was coming with dawn. The crusaders had spent weeks building their siege towers, suffering through the Palestinian summer heat, watching their numbers dwindle from dehydration and disease, and now everything depended on whether they could breach walls that had stood for centuries. The defenders knew that if they could hold for just a few more days, the Fatimid relief army would arrive and the crusaders would be forced to abandon the siege. Both sides understood that the next day would determine the outcome of the entire crusade. The crusaders spent the night in prayer and preparation. Knights checked their armour and weapons, testing straps and sharpening blades. Soldiers positioned ladders and prepared grappling hooks. The siege towers stood ready, massive wooden structures looming in the darkness like medieval skyscrapers. The chroniclers describe crusaders making confession to priests, settling debts with each other, and generally preparing for what might be their last day alive. Medieval siege assault was extraordinarily dangerous. You were climbing walls while people above dropped stones on your head, shot arrows at you, and poured boiling liquids down. The survival rate for the first wave of attackers was not encouraging. Inside the city, the garrison made their own preparations. They positioned their best troops at the sections of wall where the siege towers stood, concentrated their supplies of arrows and stones, and prepared combustible materials to set the towers on fire. Governor Iftikhar ad-Dawla had conducted an effective defence so far, and he had every reason to believe his garrison could hold until relief arrived. The walls were strong, his soldiers were motivated, and the crusaders were exhausted and desperate. From a purely military perspective, the advantage was with the defenders. Dawn came, and with it the assault began. The crusaders moved their siege towers forward, while other contingents attacked with ladders at different points along the walls. The noise must have been overwhelming. Thousands of men shouting, weapons clanging, siege engines creaking, defenders calling warnings, orders being shouted in multiple languages. Medieval battles were chaotic sensory experiences where communication was difficult and coordination was challenging. The Crusader attack was coordinated in the sense that everyone attacked at roughly the same time, but once the fighting started, it became a series of individual struggles all along the walls. Godfrey of Bouillon's siege tower on the northern wall was the main thrust. The tower was approximately 40 feet tall, which put it level with the wall's battlements. It had been covered with animal hides soaked in water to protect against fire, though these had dried somewhat in the heat and weren't as fire-resistant as intended. Inside the tower were knights and soldiers, packed together in the confined space, waiting for the tower to reach the wall so they could drop the drawbridge and assault the defenders. Moving the siege tower those final yards to the wall was incredibly difficult. The tower weighed several tons and had to be pushed over ground that wasn't perfectly level, all while defenders were shooting at the men pushing it and trying to set it on fire. The Crusaders had filled in the defensive ditch with stones and rubble to create a path, but even so, the tower had to be pushed carefully to avoid tipping or getting stuck. Medieval engineering was impressive when it worked, but siege towers had a tendency to malfunction at critical moments. Wheels would break, structures would shift, and suddenly your expensive siege equipment was a stationary target. The defenders focused their fire on Godfrey's tower, recognizing it as the greatest threat. They shot arrows at the men pushing it, dropped stones on anyone within range, and threw clay pots filled with flaming materials. At one point, the defenders managed to hit the tower with incendiaries that started a fire on the lower levels. The Crusaders inside could see smoke rising and feel the heat, which must have been terrifying. Being trapped in a burning wooden tower 40 feet in the air is not anyone's idea of a good time. Men risked their lives extinguishing the flames while under arrow fire, beating out the fire with cloaks and whatever they could use. The tower reached the wall around midday. The timing here was significant. The assault had been going for hours and both sides were exhausted. The sun, dehydration and heat exhaustion were affecting both attackers and defenders. Medieval warfare was physically demanding in ways that's hard to appreciate from written accounts. Imagine running upstairs in full armour while carrying weapons and being shot at in 90-degree heat, and you start to understand why so many medieval battles were decided by which side collapsed from exhaustion first. When the tower reached the wall, the drawbridge was dropped onto the battlements. This created a bridge perhaps 10 feet long connecting the tower to the wall. The first soldiers to cross that bridge were walking into concentrated defensive fire from soldiers who knew that if the Crusaders established a foothold, the city was lost. The chronicles disagree about who was first across. Some credit Ludolf of Tournai, others name different knights, but whoever it was displayed remarkable courage or desperation, because stepping onto that bridge meant accepting a very high probability of immediate death. The first Crusaders across fought desperately to hold their position. They were on a narrow section of wall facing defenders who outnumbered them and had the advantage of knowing the defensive position. More Crusaders poured across the drawbridge, some being shot or knocked off the walls, others making it across and joining the fight. This was close-quarters combat with swords, axes and knives, the kind of brutal hand-to-hand fighting that medieval warfare is famous for but which rarely happened in open battle. Most medieval warfare was arrows and cavalry charges. Wall fighting was the exception where you actually had to stab people personally, which required a level of violence that not every soldier was prepared for. Gradually, the Crusaders expanded their foothold. More soldiers crossed from the tower, and the sheer weight of numbers began to tell. The defenders fought hard. They knew what would happen if the city fell, but they were being pushed back. The Crusaders captured a section of wall long enough that they could bring ladders up and get more troops onto the walls. Once you lose a significant section of wall in a siege, the defensive position becomes extremely difficult to hold. The defenders tried to establish fallback positions but were being overwhelmed. Godfrey himself crossed into the fight, which was either inspiring leadership or terrible command sense depending on your perspective. Medieval nobles were expected to fight personally. It was part of their social role and military identity. But having your commanding officer in the thick of melee combat risked losing your leadership precisely when you needed coordination. However, Godfrey's presence did inspire his troops, and his fighting skills were apparently substantial. He was a large man, physically strong, and experienced in combat, exactly the kind of warrior who could dominate in close quarters fighting. By early afternoon, the Crusaders had captured enough of the northern wall that they could open one of the gates from inside. This was the turning point. Once a gate was open, troops could pour in at ground level rather than having to climb walls. The flood of Crusaders entering through the gate overwhelmed the defenders' ability to contain them. The garrison fell back toward the citadel and the Temple Mount, trying to organize defensive positions in the streets, but urban warfare favored the attackers who had momentum and numbers. At the southern wall, Raymond of Toulouse's attack was still being held when news arrived that the northern wall had been breached. The defenders at Raymond's section realized the city was falling and began to abandon their positions, either fleeing toward the citadel or trying to escape the city entirely. Raymond's forces entered through their section shortly after, and now Crusaders were in Jerusalem from multiple directions. The organized defense was collapsing into individual struggles as soldiers and civilians tried to survive or escape. What followed was massacre, and we need to talk about this directly because it's crucial to understanding both the Crusade and medieval warfare more broadly. The Crusaders killed indiscriminately as they spread through the city. Muslim civilians, Jewish residents, Eastern Christians who the Crusaders couldn't distinguish from Muslims, women, children, elderly. Anyone they encountered was liable to be killed. The violence lasted not just for hours but for days, as Crusaders went through the city systematically killing and looting. The chroniclers describe this violence in terms that are simultaneously horrific and revealing. The Christian sources often present the massacre as righteous vengeance against God's enemies, describing Crusaders wading through blood up to their ankles or knees and framing this as purifying the holy city. These accounts were written for European audiences who expected and approved of such violence against Muslims. The Muslim and Jewish sources describe it as unmitigated atrocity, emphasizing the indiscriminate killing of innocents and the violation of religious sites. Modern historians examining these accounts have concluded that while the exact death toll is unknowable, estimates range from several thousand to tens of thousands, the scale and brutality of the killing exceeded normal medieval siege warfare. The Jewish community of Jerusalem had taken refuge in the main synagogue, hoping that being non-combatants and people of the book would protect them. It didn't. The Crusaders barricaded the doors and set the building on fire, burning everyone inside alive. This massacre paralleled the Rhineland pogroms from 3 years earlier and demonstrated that the crusading movement, for all its rhetoric about liberating Christian holy sites, was equally willing to commit atrocities against Jews. The logic, such as it was, seemed to be that purifying Jerusalem meant eliminating all non-Christian presence. The Muslim population faced similar violence. Civilians who tried to surrender were killed. People hiding in their homes were dragged out and executed. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of Islam's holiest sites, became a slaughterhouse as crusaders killed everyone who had sought refuge there. The Dome of the Rock was stripped of its decorations and converted into a church. The religious significance of these sites to Muslims was completely disregarded. From the Crusaders' perspective, these were enemy buildings that needed to be conquered and Christianized. Some Muslim defenders managed to reach the citadel and negotiated surrender with Raymond of Toulouse. This act of mercy was controversial among the other Crusader leaders, some of whom wanted everyone killed regardless of surrender terms. The fact that Raymond keeping his word was notable tells you something about the general atmosphere. Most Crusaders were not interested in mercy or negotiation. The killing was driven by multiple factors. First, medieval siege warfare traditionally punished cities that resisted. The idea was to make resistance so costly that future cities would surrender rather than face assault. This was brutal but had strategic logic. Second, religious hatred was intense after 3 years of warfare. The Crusaders saw Muslims as enemies of God who deserved death. Third, loot was a motivation. Killing occupants meant you could take their possessions without dispute. Fourth, after years of suffering and hardship, the Crusaders were unleashing accumulated rage and frustration. And fifth, once mass violence starts, it creates its own momentum as inhibitions break down and atrocity becomes normalized. The chroniclers describe Crusaders going to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre after the massacre, still covered in blood, to give thanks to God. But from medieval Christian perspective, particularly crusading ideology, there was no contradiction. They'd reclaimed the holy city from God's enemies through divinely sanctioned violence. The blood they were covered in was proof of their devotion and God's favour. It's worth pausing here to consider what the Crusaders themselves thought they were doing. They genuinely believed they were conducting righteous warfare, liberating Jerusalem from Muslim occupation, and fulfilling God's will. The religious fervour that had driven them across Europe and through 3 years of suffering wasn't fake or cynical, it was real. But that genuine religious conviction led to atrocity. This is the uncomfortable truth about the First Crusade. The participants were mostly sincere in their faith, believed they were serving God, and committed horrific violence as a direct result of those beliefs. The aftermath of the massacre created immediate practical problems. You can't kill most of a city's population and expect the city to function normally. Jerusalem's economy was based on trade, pilgrimage, and local production, all of which required people. The Crusaders had just killed or expelled most of the population, including artisans, merchants, and skilled workers. The Crusaders' victory was complete, but they'd inherited a depopulated, economically damaged city that would require enormous resources to maintain. The political situation after Jerusalem's capture was complicated. Someone needed to rule the city and the surrounding territory, but who? The Crusade had been theoretically a religious pilgrimage to liberate holy sites, not a conquest to establish kingdoms. But now that they had Jerusalem, the practicalities of governance couldn't be avoided. Various nobles had competing claims and ambitions, and the question of leadership threatened to fracture the Crusade into competing factions before they'd even finished securing their conquest. Raymond of Toulouse was offered the crown but refused, making the famous statement that he wouldn't wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. Whether this was genuine humility, political calculation, or both is debated. Raymond may have believed that accepting kingship of Jerusalem was presumptuous or blasphemous. He may have calculated that the political situation was too complicated and being king would make him a target. Or he may have expected others to insist he take the crown and was surprised when they didn't. Medieval political theatre often involved elaborate performances of humility and refusal that everyone understood were performances. Godfrey of Bouillon was chosen as ruler and took the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre rather than king. This was either a similarly humble rejection of royal title or a semantic distinction without practical difference. Godfrey ruled with royal authority even if he didn't use the title. He would die less than a year later, and his brother Baldwin would succeed him and actually take the title of King of Jerusalem, suggesting that the humility about titles was temporary. Medieval politics often involved these complicated dances around titles and positions, where everyone pretended to care deeply about protocol while pursuing practical power. The Crusaders had to quickly establish defensive positions and governance because they knew counterattacks were coming. The Fatimid army was still approaching, and once the Muslim world fully understood what had happened at Jerusalem, more armies would be raised. The Crusader force that had captured the city was already smaller than it had been at Antioch, and many Crusaders were preparing to return home now that they'd fulfilled their vows. The garrison that remained to defend Jerusalem and the surrounding territory was perhaps 300 knights and a few thousand infantry, enough to hold cities, but not enough to defend the entire region. The religious significance of capturing Jerusalem cannot be overstated. For medieval Christians, this was the holiest city in the world, the site of Christ's passion and resurrection, the centre of Christian cosmology. Reclaiming it from Muslim control was seen as a world historical event, a sign that God favoured Christendom and that the apocalyptic promises of Scripture were being fulfilled. Pope Urban VI had died 2 weeks before Jerusalem fell, not knowing that his crusade had succeeded. When news reached Europe, it was treated as miraculous, and Urban would eventually be canonized as a saint partly based on initiating the crusade. The news of Jerusalem's capture spread slowly through medieval communication networks. It took weeks for word to reach Constantinople, months to reach Western Europe. When it did, European Muslims saw it as a catastrophic failure and a call to jihad. The Jewish communities of Europe and the Middle East mourned the massacres and saw the Crusades as existential threat. The capture of Jerusalem polarized the medieval world in ways that would last for centuries. The Battle of Ascalon, fought a month after Jerusalem's capture, was the final military action of the First Crusade. The Fatimid army arrived too late to save Jerusalem but still needed to be defeated to secure the Crusader conquests. Godfrey marched out with whatever forces he could muster. Many Crusaders who had been planning to leave agreed to stay for one more battle. The Fatimids were defeated decisively, their army scattered, and the immediate threat to the new Crusader states was eliminated. With Jerusalem captured, Ascalon defeated and Crusader governance being established, the First Crusade was effectively over. It had taken the Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and later the County of Tripoli, would survive for decades and in some cases over a century, requiring constant reinforcement from Europe and generating ongoing warfare with Muslim neighbours. The success of the First Crusade was, from a military perspective, extraordinary. A force of perhaps 60,000 people had travelled thousands of miles through hostile territory, fought multiple major battles against enemies who outnumbered them, besieged and captured fortified cities, and established lasting political control over territories far from any reinforcement. The logistical achievement alone was remarkable, keeping tens of thousands of people fed, supplied, and moving forward through environments ranging from Byzantine cities to Anatolian wastes to Palestinian deserts required organizational capabilities that were genuinely impressive. But the human cost was immense. Tens of thousands of crusaders died from battle, disease, starvation, and exhaustion. The casualty rate was probably over 80%, meaning most people who left Europe never returned. The violence inflicted on civilian populations, particularly at Jerusalem, was horrific even by medieval standards. The religious hatred intensified between Christianity and Islam would poison relations for generations. The massacres of Jewish communities established a pattern of crusading violence against Jews that would recur throughout the medieval period. The moral questions raised by the First Crusade are still debated today. Was it aggressive imperialism dressed up in religious rhetoric? Can the sincere religious motivations of participants excuse the atrocities committed? How do we balance the medieval context, where such violence was more normalized against universal moral standards? These aren't questions with easy answers, and historians continue to debate them. What's clear is that the First Crusade succeeded militarily in ways that surprised everyone involved, including the Crusaders themselves. They'd achieved objectives that seemed impossible at the start. They'd overcome odds that should have destroyed them multiple times. They'd established Christian states in the heart of the Muslim world, and they'd done it through a combination of military skill, religious fervour, remarkable endurance, occasional brilliant leadership, frequent good luck, and extraordinary violence. The Crusaders standing in Jerusalem in July 1099 believed they had achieved something miraculous. They'd fulfilled vows made years earlier, reached the Holy City through trials that killed most of their companions, and reclaimed Jerusalem for Christendom. From their perspective, covered in blood but victorious, this was the greatest achievement possible. They'd done God's work, secured their salvation, and changed the world. The fact that they'd done it through conquest and massacre was, in their view, not a contradiction, but a confirmation that their cause was righteous. The long-term consequences of the First Crusade would unfold over centuries. The concept of crusading would expand beyond the Holy Land to Spain, the Baltic, and even internal European conflicts. The military orders, Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights would become major powers. The commercial connections established during the Crusades would transform Mediterranean trade. The culture and the memory of the Crusades would shape Christian-Muslim relations into the modern era. But in that, they were thinking about survival, about the friends and family they'd lost, about the terrible things they'd done and witnessed, and about the religious significance of what they'd achieved. They'd started as pilgrims and become conquerors. They'd set out to visit holy sites and ended up establishing kingdoms. They'd promised to serve God and had killed thousands in his name. The crusade was over, but its consequences would echo through medieval history and beyond, shaping the world in ways the Crusaders could never have imagined. So the Crusaders had achieved the impossible. They'd captured Jerusalem, defeated multiple Muslim armies, and established Christian control over the holiest sites of their faith. Now came the arguably harder part, actually keeping what they'd conquered. Because as the Crusaders were about to learn this lesson in the most difficult way possible, through centuries of constant warfare, political intrigue, and desperate appeals for reinforcements from Europe. The immediate aftermath of Jerusalem's capture saw the establishment of what historians call the Crusader states, a collection of feudal principalities in the Levant that existed for various lengths of time, and all shared one characteristic: they were perpetually on the verge of collapse. These states were the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Together they formed a narrow strip of territory along the eastern Mediterranean coast, which sounds impressive until you look at a map and realise they were tiny enclaves surrounded by much larger Muslim territories that very much wanted them gone. The county of Edessa had already been established in 1098 by Baldwin of Boulogne, who you'll remember had split off from the main crusading army to pursue his own ambitions. Baldwin had ended up in this Armenian Christian city in northern Mesopotamia through a combination of military skill, political manoeuvring, and extremely convenient timing regarding the previous ruler's death. Edessa was the first Crusader state and would, unfortunately, also be the first to fall. It lasted until 1144, which in Crusader state terms is actually a decent run. The county was strategically problematic because it was separated from the other Crusader territories and surrounded by hostile powers, which meant it required constant military support that wasn't always available. The Principality of Antioch was Bohemond's prize for his role in capturing the city. Bohemond, you'll recall, was the Norman adventurer who had negotiated the betrayal that let Crusaders into Antioch, and who had then refused to hand the city over to the Byzantine Empire despite having sworn an oath to do exactly that. This created a diplomatic disaster with Constantinople that would poison Byzantine Crusader relations for generations. Antioch was a powerful city with strong defences and good resources, but it was also coveted by both the Byzantines, who considered it rightfully theirs, and various Muslim powers who wanted to recapture it. Bohemond spent much of his reign fighting wars on multiple fronts and trying to legitimize his control over a city he'd essentially stolen through oath-breaking and conquest. The Principality of Antioch had the distinction of being run by Normans who had recently conquered southern Italy and now controlled a major Middle Eastern city, which must have created some interesting cultural combinations. You had Vikings turned Normans turned Crusaders ruling over a population that included Greeks, Armenians, Syrian Christians, and various other groups, trying to establish a feudal European government in a region with completely different political and social traditions. It worked better than you might expect, mostly because the Normans were excellent at adapting to local circumstances while maintaining military control, but it was never stable. The Principality would survive until 1268, though it spent much of that time as a rump state, gradually losing territory to Muslim reconquest. The county of Tripoli was the last Crusader state to be formally established, not being fully conquered until 1109. Raymond of Toulouse, who'd refused to be king of Jerusalem and had various disputes with the other Crusader leaders, decided to carve out his own territory by conquering the city of Tripoli and its surrounding region. This required a siege that lasted several years. Tripoli's fortifications were strong and its garrison was determined, but Raymond was persistent, and after his death, his descendants finally captured the city. The county of Tripoli was smaller than the other states and basically served as a buffer between Antioch and Jerusalem. It would survive until 1289, making it one of the last Crusader territories to fall, though by that point it was a shadow of its former self, and more notable for still existing than for being powerful. The kingdom it controlled. Godfrey of Bouillon's brief reign as advocate of the Holy Sepulchre ended with his death in 1100, and his brother Baldwin became the first actual king of Jerusalem, apparently deciding that the humility about royal titles had been sufficiently performed and it was time to use proper royal nomenclature. The kingdom was the largest and most important of the Crusader states, but it was also the most strategically exposed, facing threats from Egypt to the south and various Syrian and Mesopotamian powers to the north and east. The kingdom's political structure was an interesting hybrid of European feudalism and adaptation to local conditions. The king theoretically ruled with absolute authority, but in practice he depended heavily on his vassals and on the military orders that would become crucial to the kingdom's defence. The Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller were military religious orders that combined monastic discipline with military function, creating essentially professional standing armies of warrior monks who took vows of poverty, chastity and obedience, while also being highly trained cavalry. This was a uniquely medieval solution to the problem of maintaining military strength in a hostile region far from reinforcement. You created soldiers who were motivated by religious devotion rather than payment, and who therefore wouldn't desert when the money ran out. The population of the Crusader states was predominantly not European. The Crusaders formed a ruling minority, probably less than 20% of the population, governing over a majority that included Greek Orthodox Christians, various Eastern Christian groups, Muslims, Jews, and others. This created a complex social hierarchy, where European Latin Christians were at the top, Eastern Christians occupied a middle tier with limited rights and protections, and Muslims and Jews were at the bottom with minimal rights, but were often tolerated because they were necessary for the economy to function. It was feudalism with extra layers of religious and ethnic division, which is about as complicated as social structures get. The economy of the Crusader states was based on agriculture, trade, and continuous military expenditure. The Italians got rich, the Crusader states got a navy they couldn't have afforded to build themselves, and everyone was happy except the Muslims whose trade was being disrupted. Agriculture in the interior was productive when it wasn't being raided or disrupted by warfare, which unfortunately was much of the time. The military situation of the Crusader states was perpetually precarious. They were outnumbered by surrounding Muslim powers, couldn't recruit sufficient soldiers locally, and depended on reinforcements from Europe that arrived irregularly and often too late. The Crusaders became expert castle builders, constructing fortifications that were architectural marvels and military nightmares for attackers. Castles like Crac de Chevalier were so well designed that they could hold out for years against siege, and they projected power far beyond their walls. But castles only work as a defensive strategy if you have enough soldiers to garrison them and armies to relieve them when besieged. The cultural impact of the Crusader states was more significant than their relatively small size and brief existence might suggest. They became a point of contact between Western Europe and the Islamic world, facilitating exchange of knowledge, technology, and ideas despite the ongoing warfare. European crusaders encountered Arab science, medicine, and philosophy, bringing some of it back to Europe. They learned military techniques and siege warfare methods that would influence European military development. They encountered new crops, spices, and trade goods that stimulated European commerce. The cultural exchange was often hostile. Conquest and warfare aren't ideal contexts for intellectual dialogue, but it happened anyway because human societies in contact inevitably influence each other. The artistic and architectural legacy of the Crusader states is still visible today in the surviving fortifications, churches, and buildings. They restored and rebuilt Christian sites that had been neglected or converted to other uses. They constructed fortifications that were marvels of medieval military engineering. These physical remains are perhaps the most tangible legacy of the Crusader presence, outlasting the states themselves by centuries. The long-term consequences for East-West relations were profound and mostly negative. The First Crusade and the Crusader states it created poisoned relations between Christianity and Islam for generations. The massacres at Jerusalem and elsewhere created a legacy of bitterness and desire for revenge that Muslim leaders would invoke when calling for jihad against the Crusaders. The concept of religious war, warfare justified and motivated by religious difference, became entrenched on both sides, with Christians seeing crusading as virtuous and Muslims seeing resistance to crusaders as religiously mandated. This mutual religious hostility would outlast the Crusader states themselves and influence Christian-Muslim relations into the modern era. The impact on Byzantine-Western relations was similarly destructive. The Byzantine Empire had requested military help, hoping for mercenaries who would serve under imperial command and return conquered Byzantine territory. What they got were independent armies that established their own states, refused Byzantine authority, and often treated the Byzantines with contempt. The Crusaders saw the Byzantines as effete, untrustworthy Greeks who had lost their territories through incompetence. The Byzantines saw the Crusaders as barbarian oathbreakers who had stolen Byzantine cities. The crusading movement that the First Crusade initiated would continue for 2 centuries. There would be 7 more major-numbered crusades, the 2nd through 9th Crusades, plus numerous smaller expeditions, ongoing campaigns in Spain and the Baltic, and a permanent crusading culture in medieval Europe. None of the subsequent crusades would achieve the success of the first. The Second Crusade, 1147-1149, was a complete failure. The Third Crusade, 1189-1192, had some successes under Richard the Lionheart but failed to recapture Jerusalem. The Fourth Crusade, 1202-1204, never even reached the Holy Land, instead sacking Constantinople. The later Crusades were increasingly desperate attempts to shore up failing Crusader states or recapture lost territories. The military orders that emerged from the Crusades, the Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, and Teutonic Knights, became major powers in medieval Europe. The Hospitallers survived the fall of the Crusader states and continued operating from Rhodes and later Malta into the modern era. These military orders were direct legacies of the First Crusade's need for permanent military forces in the Holy Land. The intellectual impact of the Crusades on Europe was substantial. Europeans who travelled to the East encountered advanced Arab scholarship in fields like mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. They brought Arabic numerals, advanced algebra, improvements in medicine and surgery, philosophical texts that had been lost in the West but preserved in Arabic translation. All of these flowed to Europe partly through Crusader contact. The irony that religious warfare facilitated intellectual exchange was probably lost on contemporaries, but is obvious to historians. The economic impact was equally significant. The need to transfer money and resources between Europe and the Crusader states led to innovations in banking and finance. The demand for ships created a maritime industry that would eventually enable European exploration and colonization. The Crusades were economically transformative even as they were militarily and morally problematic. The mythologization of the First Crusade began almost immediately and continues to the present. Medieval chroniclers portrayed it as a divinely ordained mission that succeeded through God's favour and the Crusaders' faith. This narrative emphasized the religious righteousness of the cause, downplayed or justified the violence, and presented the Crusaders as heroic warriors of Christ. These chronicles were written primarily by clerics for European Christian audiences who wanted to hear about Christian victories and divine miracles, so they're not exactly objective historical sources, but they shaped how the Crusade was remembered. The legend of the Crusades was perpetuated through epic poems, songs, and stories that circulated in medieval Europe. The chansons de geste, songs of deeds, portrayed Crusaders as idealized Christian knights undertaking heroic adventures. These literary works emphasized courage, faith, and martial prowess, while conveniently ignoring the less savory aspects like the massacres, the starvation, the disease, and the frequent cases of Crusaders fighting each other. The medieval literary tradition created a romanticized version of crusading that bore limited resemblance to the historical reality, but was much more appealing to aristocratic audiences. This romanticization continued through the centuries. The Renaissance saw renewed interest in Crusader history, though with increasing skepticism about the religious justifications. The Enlightenment brought critical examination of crusading violence and religious warfare, with philosophers like Voltaire using the Crusades as examples of religious fanaticism and intolerance. The 19th century brought another swing toward romanticization, with Victorian writers and artists portraying Crusaders as chivalric heroes, though this was as much about Victorian ideals of masculinity and empire as about the actual Crusades. Modern historiography of the Crusades has been contentious and politically charged. 20th century historians worked to strip away the mythological elements and examine the Crusades as complex historical events with multiple causes, diverse participants, and ambiguous outcomes. The rise of post-colonial scholarship brought attention to the Crusades as an early example of European imperialism and religious warfare, emphasizing the violence inflicted on Muslims and Jews and questioning the traditional European-centered narratives. Were they defensive responses to Islamic expansion or aggressive Christian imperialism? How do we balance understanding the medieval context with moral evaluation of the violence? The political appropriation of crusading imagery and rhetoric has continued into the modern era, usually in ways that misunderstand or distort the historical reality. Both Christian and Muslim extremists have invoked crusading history to justify their positions. though usually with selective reading that ignores inconvenient facts. Western politicians have occasionally used crusading rhetoric, usually to their regret once someone points out the problematic historical parallels. The Crusades remain politically contentious because they touch on ongoing tensions between Christianity and Islam, Western and Middle Eastern cultures, and questions about religious violence and imperialism. One persistent myth is that the Crusades were unprovoked Christian aggression against peaceful Muslims. The reality was more complicated. The Byzantine Empire had been losing territory to Turkish expansion and had requested military aid. Christian pilgrims did face increasing difficulties reaching Jerusalem, and the Eastern Christian communities under Muslim rule did face persecution at times. But it's also true that the Crusader response went far beyond defensive warfare, involved conquest and colonization, and inflicted violence on civilians that exceeded military necessity by any measure. Both the unprovoked aggression narrative and the defensive liberation narrative are oversimplifications that miss the complexity of 11th century geopolitics. Another myth is that the Crusades were primarily about economic motivations, nobles seeking land and wealth through conquest. While most crusaders who survived didn't get rich, they went home poorer than they'd left. The few who did establish territories in the east like Baldwin and Bohemond were exceptions. Economic factors mattered, but they weren't the primary motivation for most participants. A third myth is that the Crusades were a simple conflict between Christianity and Islam, two monolithic religions fighting for control of holy sites. In reality, both sides were deeply divided. Muslims fought Muslims, Sunni versus Shia, competing dynasties, political rivals. The religious element was real and significant, but it was layered over political, ethnic, economic, and personal conflicts that often trumped religious solidarity. The historiographical debates about the Crusades continue because they raise fundamental questions about religion, violence, and civilization that remain relevant. Can religious warfare ever be justified? How do we evaluate historical violence? By the standards of the time or by universal moral principles? What responsibility do religious institutions bear for violence committed in their name? How do we balance understanding historical context with moral judgment? These aren't just academic questions. They have implications for how we think about contemporary conflicts involving religion and violence. Militarily, it was an extraordinary success that established Christian states in a hostile region far from support. Politically, it created entities that lasted for generations and influenced Mediterranean geopolitics for centuries. Economically, it stimulated trade and commercial development. Culturally, it facilitated exchange between civilizations despite the violence. But morally, it involved horrific violence against civilians, massacre of Jews and Muslims, and religious warfare that poisoned interfaith relations for generations. It can be simultaneously all of these things, a remarkable military achievement and a moral catastrophe, a manifestation of genuine religious devotion, and an exercise in conquest and colonization. For the participants themselves, the First Crusade was the defining experience of their lives. Those who survived had travelled farther than most medieval people could imagine, fought in battles they would tell stories about for the rest of their lives, and achieved something that seemed miraculous. They'd suffered terribly, watched friends die of disease and starvation, endured wounds and illnesses, experienced heat and cold and thirst beyond what most people would endure. But they'd reached Jerusalem, accomplished their mission, and secured what they believed was their salvation. From their perspective, it was all worth it. The Crusader states would eventually fall. Edessa in 1144, Jerusalem in 1187, Antioch in 1268, Tripoli and Acre in 1291. Each loss prompted new crusades from Europe, desperate attempts to reclaim what had been lost, but the momentum was with the Muslims. Saladin's reconquest of Jerusalem in 1187 demonstrated that the Crusader states were ultimately unsustainable. They were small territories surrounded by hostile neighbours, dependent on distant reinforcements, and governing populations that didn't particularly want to be governed by European Christians. The wonder isn't that they fell, but that they lasted as long as they did. The First Crusade created a precedent for religious warfare that would influence European and Middle Eastern history for centuries. The idea that warfare could be not just justified but spiritually meritorious if directed against religious enemies, that killing could be not just permissible but praiseworthy if done in defense of faith, that conquest could be holy if it served religious purposes. These ideas didn't originate with the Crusades, but the Crusades gave them concrete form and lasting influence. The crusading ideal would be applied far beyond the Holy Land to Spain, the Baltic, even internal European conflicts against heretics and political enemies of the papacy. For modern historians and audiences, the First Crusade presents a challenge. How do we understand and explain an event that combines genuine religious devotion with horrific violence, remarkable military achievement with atrocity, human endurance with human cruelty? How do we tell the story honestly without either romanticizing the violence or dismissing the sincere faith that motivated most participants? How do we acknowledge both the historical importance and the moral problems? There's no easy answer. It demonstrated the power of religious motivation to drive human action, both constructive and destructive. It showed that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when driven by faith and purpose, even if what they achieved was morally ambiguous. It revealed the dangers of religious certainty, the ease with which violence can be justified by appealing to divine will, and the human capacity for both remarkable endurance and shocking cruelty. The story of the First Crusade is ultimately a human story, of people making choices, enduring hardship, achieving goals, and inflicting suffering, all within a framework of beliefs and values that made sense to them, even if they trouble us. It's a story worth knowing, not because it offers simple lessons or clear morals, but because it reveals truths about human nature, religious motivation, historical change, and the complicated relationship between noble ideals and violent actions. So that's the story of the First Crusade, from Pope Urban's speech in Clermont to the capture of Jerusalem and the establishment of Crusader states. It's a story of 3 years and thousands of miles, of battles won and lost, of starvation and disease and desperate fighting, of religious faith driving people to both remarkable endurance and terrible violence. It's a story that changed the medieval world and whose consequences echoed through centuries. It's a story that historians still debate, and that remains relevant to understanding religious warfare, cultural conflict, and human motivation. And now, the First Crusade was many things: triumph and tragedy, faith and violence, achievement and atrocity, and understanding it requires holding all of these contradictions in mind. So wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into crusading history. Sweet dreams, peaceful sleep, and may your dreams be less violent than the history we've just explored. Good night, everyone.